When I was 16, my uncle was like Crocodile Dundee. Tough, missing a finger, always carried a big knife and rifle. He knew every inch of those rocky Mexican hills where our family lived. The locals always whispered about witches in the mountains, how the cartels would hire them to curse enemies. My grandma put scissors in a cross above our door to keep them away. That summer we went on an 8-hour night hunt for rabbits, taking our 2 German shepherds with us. The moon was full, and everything on the hills was perfectly illuminated. We were heading toward an old abandoned mine that people said was cursed. My uncle joked that if we saw a coyote, he'd wear its tail on his belt for luck with women. I had no idea that night would destroy the man I looked up to most. We left at dusk because he said the rabbits would start moving once the heat broke, and we drove until the ruts got too ugly for his old Nissan to handle. Then we hiked. He handed me the slingshot and a pouch of steel balls because ammo was expensive and loud, and rabbits didn't need a .30-06 to the head. Thor healed without being told. Tambo ranged and circled, always checking back. My uncle kept the rifle low, and the knife canted forward on his belt so it wouldn't poke his thigh on climbs. Every few minutes he'd point out a landmark, an old corral post, a rock like a turtle, so I'd learn the way back without him. He kept up the coyote jokes. He always did that when he was alert. But his eyes worked the ridges and dry gullies in a slow sweep. If we spooked anything bigger than rabbits, we'd back off. That was the rule. Now, before I explain what happened next, you need to understand my uncle didn't really buy the bruja stuff. He said the scissors were for my grandma's nerves, and the egg cleanses were side hustles. Still, he didn't like places where people did weird things. On the ridge above the mine, we found puddled wax and a little bundle of bones tied with red thread. He scuffed it with his boot and said, "Cartel kids trying to scare each other." But he didn't smile. By midnight the rabbits went scarce, and the jokes about coyote tales were thinner. The moon was bright enough to shut off our headlamps, but it flattened depth, so sounds jumped around. We crossed a shallow arroyo and climbed into rock that stacked like teeth, and from there you could see the mine at it, just a dark slot and a fence fallen in a V. Thor huffed and stared. Tambo chewed grass and spat it out like he realized it tasted wrong. Around 3 a.m. we reached the mine area and saw a huge white owl flying overhead. My uncle laughed and said it was probably a witch, but our dog Tambo started growling at it intensely. The other dog, Thor, had run ahead toward the mine and we couldn't see him anymore. I told my uncle I'd check if the mine was flooded while he looked for Thor. Inside with my flashlight, the silence was eerie. No bats chirping like usual. The mine was flooded about a quarter way in, and my flashlight started dimming even though I wasn't deep enough for that to happen. When I turned to head back, I stopped walking but could still hear wet shoe squeaking behind me. The sound was exactly like my shoes made, coming from one of the forked paths. I stood very still and lifted my heel and set it down to hear my own squeak, then waited. From the left fork came one more quiet squeak a half-beat late, like someone was copying me. "Hola?" I called, because sometimes people cut through old tunnels, and I didn't want to spook anybody into doing something dumb. No answer. I heard a small slosh like a toe tapping in water, and my light guttered to a smaller cone even though the batteries were new. I told myself it was Thor and that the echo was weird in there, and I started to take a step. Then I heard someone say, "Tambo," in an almost mocking voice, but it didn't sound right. I flashed my light toward the sound and saw something tall with a smile, moving in jerky motions. It looked like a person if they were completely out of focus, maybe with yellow eyes. I threw my slingshot at it, and it made a sound like screeching tires before I ran. Outside, Tambo was growling at the mine entrance, then started following me as I ran to find my uncle. I ran too fast on the gravel and skidded, caught myself, whistled the way my uncle did to bring the dogs tight. Tambo stuck to my knee and kept looking back at the hole, grumbling. I shouted my uncle's name and got it back from the rocks, and then heard a noise like a sob and boots scuffing. He was about 50 feet away, kneeling and crying over Thor's body with a knife stuck in it. He said he found him like that, but his voice was shaking. Thor was on his side with the handle sunk behind his shoulder and the fur around it black and wet. My uncle had his palm on Thor's ribs like he expected them to move anyway, and he touched the handle and snatched his hand back like it burned. Tambo sniffed Thor's neck and then planted his feet and growled at the mine again. "Don't touch it," I told my uncle, pointless words, and he wiped his face on his sleeve and stood. He turned slow with the rifle halfway up like he expected somebody behind us. I told him fast about the voice saying Tambo and the way it moved, and he stared at me like he wanted me to be kidding. Then he decided I wasn't. "We're leaving," he said, flat and hard, and he worked the bolt just to hear it and took point. I clipped Tambo's lead and he pulled toward the adit and then away like he couldn't decide. We cut the short way to the truck instead of the easy way, side-hilling across junk rock that wanted to slide. My uncle talked low. "Left foot here, now right," and kept scanning the ridge lines and gullies and all the places a man could wait. I kept checking our backs because of that smile in the dark, and each time I looked, nothing moved, which somehow felt worse. On the far slope, something crouched and froze when the rifle swung, then melted into brush like it had always been dirt. The mine stayed behind us, but it didn't feel behind, like the dark had grown long arms. We could hear coyotes howling all around us in the hills, and I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. My uncle slid Thor into a rock crevasse just off the trail, hands careful like he was lifting a sleeping kid, and he kept looking over his shoulder every few seconds like he expected a person to step out of the brush. He didn't try to pull the knife, he just pressed Thor's ears flat, took off the collar, and tucked it into his pocket. He said, "Lo siento viejo," under his breath, then scanned the ridge and the mine mouth and the broken fence. He nodded once at nothing and said, "We go now." Tambo whined and backed away. We walked in complete silence. Tambo's nails clicked on flat rock and then went quiet in the sand. And every time he stopped, I stopped, because that was the rule. My uncle pivoted and covered the gap behind us like he was on a job. I didn't tell him what I saw in the mine. I didn't ask who stuck the knife in Thor. The whole way back, I felt eyes on us from the dark between the hills. Twice we heard rock skitter like a small slide, and Tambo bristled, but nothing moved when we turned. Not a sound. At the truck, my uncle walked a slow circle, checked the tires for cuts, checked the bed, checked the back seat before he opened it, then laid the rifle on the bench. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine for a breath. He said, "Seatbelt," and I clicked it because he never said it twice. The ruts out scraped the muffler, and I braced my hand on the dash. Tambo lay on the floor and shivered each time the headlights hit a fence post that wasn't there a second before, then was. We passed the gate in silence. We got home at sunrise. He parked crooked and went straight to his room and closed the door, and I heard the lock turn. I put water down for Tambo, and he drank too fast and coughed, then stared at the door like he expected my uncle to step out and bark orders. My grandma called from the kitchen, asked why we were early, and I said we didn't get anything. She stood with the towel in her hands and asked where Thor was. I said he ran off. She watched me like she knew I lied. I avoided her. He didn't come out for days. I left a plate by his door and heard the fork scrape once, and then not again. At night, Tambo stood in the hallway and listened to nothing and rumbled like the nothing was pacing, and sometimes he looked past me like I was in the way. That was the last time I saw my uncle as the strong man he used to be. Something had followed us home from those hills, something the locals might call a Wendigo. Not a storybook thing, but a cold that eats up a man slowly and quiet. The next year when I visited, my uncle had become the town drunk, skin and bones, teeth loose, and then gone. He was a broken, shaky man who'd lost every bit of respect, and even his brothers were embarrassed and kept him outside the shop like a stray that used to belong to them. He hovered near the store and asked for beer money in a voice that didn't fit his face. Sometimes he reached into his pocket and touched Thor's collar, and then forgot why. If someone mentioned the mine, he looked at the ground and changed the subject. None of us understood what happened to him, but the change was complete and never let up. My family whispered the witches got to him, or that something ancient had marked him and kept collecting. Locals told stories about Wendigos there, spirits that steal strength and wear a man's name thin. Whatever my uncle met that night, it hollowed him from the inside. I never told anyone about the thing in the mine speaking Tambo's name. I think he saw worse. I avoid those hills. The Wendigo had taken everything that made my uncle who he was, leaving only an empty shell behind. When I was 21, me and my study partner Alex volunteered to check out this abandoned weather station deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. We were fourth-year atmospheric science students, and we thought it'd just be a hike with some dusty instruments and maybe a stuck anemometer we could brag about fixing on Monday. And I guess we were cocky about it because when we signed the trip request, the older guys at the service gave us these tight little smiles like, "Okay, heroes," and one guy actually said, "You're going to that one?" Which should have made us think twice. The last gas in town, the cashier woman kinda smirked when I said the station's name, and she told us people heard long wailing sounds in winter. "Like a whistle you feel in your teeth," she said. And I laughed because it was August and I figured it was just wind off a canyon lip. But when the afternoon faded and the trail dropped into a shaded draw and the GPS got jittery, we stopped laughing. The path wasn't maintained like the map said. It twisted through manzanita that clawed at our pants and then broke into a slope of stove-sized talus where you had to test every rock with the toe of your boot. And I kept telling Alex we'd beat sunset if we kept moving, which was true until the last ridge where the light just dropped out and it felt like the mountain shrugged. We hit the place at evening, a rusted metal tower that once had paint and now only had corrosion, and at its base a small meteorologist's cabin with one wall sagging inward like a pushed-in cheek. And there wasn't a bird song or bug sound within earshot, just the little click of my carabiner when I breathed. Inside, the air felt dead, and when I say dead, I mean it didn't move even when we opened the door wide and stood there like idiots letting mosquitoes in, and the only things that looked like they mattered were the radio racks against the far wall, ancient stuff with cracked dials and tape labels from the 80s, and a battery locker that was empty except for dust. The two folding cots had canvas like old paper, and under them we found these grooves, deep ones, cut into the floorboards in parallel. My first thought was a hand truck or something dragged heavy over and over, but the spacing was off. And when Alex ran his finger along one edge, he said, "It's like a claw or a blade, dude." And he tried to laugh and couldn't. Across the room, on the opposite wall, dark stains went up 3 feet from the baseboard, brown-black, dry, flaky, and I said, "Rust water," even though that didn't make sense on wood, and he nodded way too fast. Outside, the wind picked up in that on-off way of mountain gusts, and the tower made this long, low groan like a ship turning, and the cable stays pinged so high it almost hurt. We unrolled our bags on the floor, and I tried the base set on the radio with the portable battery pack we'd hauled up. Got a carrier for half a second, and then only static, the kind that hisses and pops like it's thinking about a voice but won't commit, and I logged it in the field notebook anyway because that's what you do. The generator out back was seized and dry, no fuel, oil like tar, and the recoil handle wouldn't budge, So we wrote that down too, and pulled out 2 LED lanterns that were fresh that morning. And as the last usable light died, the silence settled in. Not total, because you always get timber ticks and sheet metal cooldown, but heavy, like the kind you count your own breaths in. Sometime late, no clock after my phone died looking for a signal, I woke to this sound that I don't have a good word for. Something between a moan and a howl. And what messed me up was it felt far and near at the same time. Like it came from the canyon bottom and also from just outside the door. And it slid up in pitch at the end like it wanted an answer. I've heard cougars scream and foxes bark and the stupid ballooning whoop of wind in a stovepipe. But it wasn't any of those, and I hissed Alex's name and he was already sitting up, eyes big. He said, "Generator, just in case." Which didn't make sense, but it was an excuse to be doing something. So he pulled on his boots and slipped outside with the lantern, and I watched the seams of the door and tried not to think about the grooves in the floor. He came back fast, pale, and breathing through his mouth, and the only thing he said was, "You heard that too." Like if I said no, we'd get to leave. And I said yes, and that made it worse somehow. We slid the bolt on the door and shoved a cot against it because that made us feel like we were taking an action. I know how that sounds, but it helps. And we killed the lantern to save the battery and sat there with our headlamps off because the cones of light kept making the dust float look like movement in the corners. Around midnight, guessing by how long my back had hurt, the sound came again, closer. Enough that the wall to my right vibrated so faint I felt it through my shoulder blade before I heard it. And the tower outside hummed for 3 beats and then stopped like it was listening. I'd been counting creaks. There are patterns in old buildings. You start to know them. And this was not a pattern. It was like something testing the cabin envelope. First near the roof line, then low, then back to the tower guys. And every time it moved, the air pressure changed just slightly, and my eardrums did that click-pop thing. We whispered because that's what people do when they're trying to act normal. Alex said, "It's wind pulsing in the canyon. Resonance." And I said, "Yep," even though the gusts had died 10 minutes before and the trees weren't moving. I kept thinking about the stains and trying not to, and once when a crossbeam popped like a knuckle, Alex flinched hard enough to squeak his bag liner, and we both laughed too loudly and went quiet fast. I told him, "We'll log it, we'll be out at first light." And he said, "I'm not sleeping." And I said, "Me either." But that wasn't true, because sometime after that, I remember the lantern's battery indicator dropping a bar when I checked it. I must have drifted with my boots still on and my hand on the field notebook like it mattered. Morning comes late in a place like that because the ridge holds the sun back, so it was gray when I opened my eyes. That mean kind of gray you get before direct light. And my neck was kinked and my mouth was cotton. And for a second I thought I was at home because that's what brains do. And then I smelled old dust and old metal and the lantern's plastic off-gassing. And I sat up and said, "Alex?" Without really thinking. The window was a brighter rectangle, but not by much. My left knee had a dent from sleeping against the notebook. The cot we'd shoved against the door was still there, bolt still thrown. I reached for the lantern, thumbed it, got a dimmer beam than I wanted, and swept it once across the radio rack and then the floor where our bags were. And that's when I saw that Alex's sleeping bag was ripped wide open, torn fabric scattered across the floor. His boots and jacket were still sitting exactly where he'd left them by the door. I called his name, and it just bounced off the cabin walls, nothing coming back but my own voice. Outside, the sand and dust lay perfectly smooth, not a single footprint anywhere around the station. I checked the outhouse, the tower base, the dead tanks, the porch crawl. I widened my circles and shouted until my throat was raw and the echoes thinned to nothing. The radio still wasn't working, and my phone showed no signal at all. I spent the second night alone with the cots against the door. and heavy thuds hit the cabin walls for hours, spaced like someone pacing the perimeter and leaning in. I didn't open the door. At first light, I stepped out and saw something fluttering on the tower, a strip caught on a bolt head, Alex's shirt, with dark stains. And that's when I knew he was gone, and I needed to get out fast. I dismantled the cots and built a makeshift cart to carry gear across the desert terrain. Rails from the straightest legs, canvas as a sling, paracord for lashing. I packed water, flares, first aid, 2 bars, a lantern. I took a bearing toward the old service road and skirted the drainage because sand grabbed the wheels. I moved in bursts from rock to rock, and between those markers I kept hearing footsteps behind me that stopped when I stopped. By late afternoon, the strap burned my shoulder and my hands were blistering, so I relashed the load lower. Near dusk, I found a rock overhang with a flat patch, backed the cart in, flipped it as a barrier, and wedged it. I ate half a bar, sipped water, checked the flare, killed the lantern. Something circled my camp for hours, gravel popping, pauses like it was measuring. I held the multi-tool open and didn't look out because looking would light my face. The wind raised dust devils across the flats, and until I saw a figure among the rocks ahead, too tall and angular to be human, with limbs too long by a third. It watched me from a distance, never closing in. Not once. Ever. Every time I tried for a better look, walking left, adjusting the cart, turning fast, it slipped behind a fin of stone, and 50 yards later, it would be somewhere else at the same angle. "I see you," I said, and kept walking. That night I sheltered under another overhang, and something paced again. Closer, and once the cart bumped like a hand tested it. I stared at the rock and didn't move. Before sunrise, I fired the first emergency flare and watched it claw up and bloom red. I waited and fired the second at noon. By late day, I heard rotors and saw a helicopter nose into view, and 2 ground techs in orange came up my line. One said my name like a question. They gave me electrolytes and a blanket. In the truck, I told the younger one to slow near the station cut, and he shook his head and said they'd go back with a full team. At night, a nurse with a badge that said Maria adjusted my IV and asked how many were in our party. I whispered it wasn't trying to hurt anyone, just lonely after being alone so long. She froze but said nothing. Later, she brought ice and tucked the blanket and didn't meet my eye. And when the door stayed cracked, I heard 2 orderlies say the station's name and then go quiet. And locals know the old stories even if they don't talk about them. I still log pressure out of habit, and when the needle drops before dawn, I remember those thuds and the tower hum, and I tell myself what I told Maria, because it's the only version that lets me sleep. I walked away because it let me. It keeps to the place it knows. It learned the shape of that station, and then learned us. And when the wind carries a sound too, even to be a voice, I stop listening and keep moving. So for context, I was 19, and my friends and I would always hang out at this farmhouse on the outskirts of Amish country. The rest of us lived closer to town, so we'd always drive out late at night to get back home. This particular night around 1 a.m., I was driving my friend Jake back to his place through these winding country roads. Jake's the biggest skeptic you'll ever meet. Thinks all scary stories are complete bullshit and gets annoyed when people even bring up supernatural stuff. We were just chatting about life as I drove. Nothing unusual about the night at all. The roads were empty like they always were that time of night. Just dark farmland on both sides. I was coming up over this hill when something in my headlights made my blood freeze. What I saw on the side of that road still haunts me to this day. The hill isn't huge, just one of those long humps where the other side drops and you can't see much until you're committed. So I eased off the gas cause deer love that stretch, and I've smacked one before. Nothing looked off, No fog, no cars. And Jake was mid-rant about quitting his grocery job to detail cars. I was nodding, doing gas money math, when the beam slid over the ditch and the gravel shoulder and landed on something pale just standing there like it had been waiting. My hands tightened on the wheel before I knew why. The body knows before the brain. At the bottom of the hill, my headlights illuminated this weird white figure standing on the roadside. It was big enough that you couldn't mistake it for any normal animal. Maybe 6 feet tall and white as fresh snow. The thing looked vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Like someone had stretched a person too far. In the few seconds we had it in view, it twitched and moved in these unnatural, jerky motions. Its movements were completely unlike anything I'd ever seen from a human or animal. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3 seconds as we drove past, but both Jake and I went completely silent. After a few seconds of stunned silence, I finally asked Jake if he saw what I saw. "Dude, did you see?" I started, and then cut myself off because the last flicker in the mirror didn't belong to anything normal. It snapped again, a full-body jerk like bad stop motion, the head lagging behind like a glitch. I didn't slow down. If anything, I sped up a hair, because overcorrecting on those roads puts you in a culvert. "What the hell was that?" I said. Jake kept staring straight ahead. "I saw it," he said. No sarcasm. Just that. I signaled for nothing, habit, then killed it, and kept us straight. Turning around felt like volunteering for something I didn't understand. "It's a prank," Jake said. "Some idiot in a sheet." He shook his head like even he didn't buy it. "A sheet doesn't move like that," I said. "And who waits on County 12 at 1 a.m. hoping a car shows up?" He had no answer. We passed the feed co-op and the blinking tower light, and I kept checking the rear view like I expected it to sprint after us. Which is insane, I know, but tell that to my hands. Near the stone bridge he tried again. Maybe a deer with mange. "Deer don't stand upright," I said. "I'm not going back." He said he wasn't asking. Now, before I explain the end of the drive, you need to understand Jake doesn't give ground on anything. He kept trying to stack logic, costume, light tricks, drugs, then knocking it over because the pieces didn't fit. He asked if I had service. One useless bar. "Call who?" I said. "Tell them a stretched-out snowman did the robot at the bottom of Miller Hill?" He didn't laugh. We crossed Bender Road and I forced my brain onto rails. Mirror, blinker, speed, stay between the lines. An old pickup came the other way and I flashed mine to be polite. Part of me wanted to flag him and ask if he'd seen it, but I didn't. "If it was a person, we should have stopped," Jake said. "If it was a person, they needed a hospital, not us," I said. "If it was a person, it would have looked at us," he said. And that landed hard because it never looked. It just twitched like it was catching up to being in a body. I held 5 over. At the T by the church, I turned left toward his subdivision. "I hate saying this," he said, "but don't drop me off alone." I told him I'd wait with the engine running and the porch light on. That helped. I pulled into his driveway and left the highs on the street for extra light. Probably annoyed a neighbor didn't care. He sat for an extra second like he was waiting to see if I'd tell him to man up. I didn't. "Text me when you're inside," I said. He jogged up, key fumbled once, got the door open, and threw a quick wave. I watched him lock it, then waited another minute on principle. The whole cul-de-sac felt too open. No trees close in, no shadows to search. And somehow that made it worse, like there was nowhere for anything to hide except the obvious places. I put it in drive and rolled slow until the stop sign, checked the mirror again, saw nothing, turned, and didn't breathe normal until I hit the lights by the highway. Later, at home, I lay there staring at the ceiling like I was waiting for a tap at the window, and every normal explanation tore at the seams. Costume, deer, trick of the lights. None of it fit because of those jerky movements and the lagging head and that cold certainty we'd seen something we weren't meant to. In the morning, we compared notes over text. Height, exact spot on the shoulder, how it didn't track the car, and neither of us slept much. I don't claim anything, but when even Jake keeps repeating, "That wasn't right," and refuses that road for weeks, you start reaching for whatever the locals say to make sense of those fields at night. And some locals in those parts talk about Wendigos, creatures that used to be human but got twisted into something else. The thing about Wendigos is they're always described as unnaturally tall and white, with movements that don't look quite human. In Amish country, there are old stories about people who went missing in harsh winters and came back changed. They say hunger can drive a person to do terrible things, and sometimes those things follow them even after death. The way that figure moved, all twitchy and wrong, reminded me of something fighting against its own body. Like whatever was inside that white shape wasn't meant to be walking upright anymore. Jake and I never went back to that road, and we stopped hanging out at the farmhouse soon after. Every time we drive through the area, we take the long way around to avoid that particular stretch. The memory of those jerky, unnatural movements still makes my skin crawl years later. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't anything that belonged in our world. We didn't make some big pact. It just happened. A week later, someone mentioned a bonfire out there and I said I was busy, and Jake said he had an early shift, and neither of us pushed. When we had to pass through that part of the county for anything, we added 15 minutes without talking about it. I'd catch myself checking the shoulder where we saw it even at noon. We left it there. I'm not a believer, I'm a pattern person, and the pattern lines up more than I'm comfortable with, especially the jerks and the way the head seemed detached from the movement. I pulled articles from small-town papers about winter disappearances and quotes from game wardens who had no explanation, but advised drivers to keep going if they saw anything strange. There are forum posts that read like ours. Late drive, empty shoulder, white shape at the edge of the ditch. One guy said it followed his car at an intersection without moving its feet, which sounds ridiculous until you remember the way something can look wrong even when it isn't technically impossible. A librarian at the Historical Society pointed me to a local pamphlet about famine years and starving sickness, and the margins had notes about families not letting doors face certain fields. It's folklore, sure, but folklore lasts because people need reasons to follow rules that keep them alive. None of that proves anything, but it makes the shape on that shoulder feel less like a glitch and more like an entry in a long list. Jake doesn't do research. He shrugs it off with, "It was a guy or whatever," but his voice goes flat. When a friend wanted to cut through that road to save time, Jake said no so fast it got quiet in the car. We've never gone over the exact 3 seconds again because there's nothing to add. He'll still joke about everything else, but when someone says Wendigo as a punchline, he changes topics. It's not drama, it's maintenance. He keeps his life pointed away from that shoulder, and that's that. I changed routes for late jobs. I keep an eye on the mirror more than I used to. If I have to take a 2-lane with ditches, I watch the edges like they're lanes of their own and leave space to swerve without rolling. I added a dash cam, sure, but I also don't put myself in places where I'd need it. People say fear fades. This didn't. The image is simple. A white shape, too tall, body stuttering like bad video, no eyes tracking us. Just a thing that existed for 3 seconds and then kept existing after we passed it. All I know is that Jake, who doesn't believe in anything supernatural, still gets quiet when someone mentions that night. We've never talked about it in detail since, but I can see it in his eyes sometimes. The memory of something that shouldn't exist, standing on a dark country road at 1 in the morning, does not soften. I drive different routes now when I'm out late, always checking my mirrors more than I used to. Because once you've seen something like that, you never feel completely safe in the dark again. It happened last summer when my dad Roy suggested we go hiking through southern Utah's canyon country together. We'd grown distant after Mom died, avoiding the hard talks. Dad was a former Marine survival instructor who never really settled down after retirement, always leading groups through harsh landscapes. When he proposed a 2-week trek through remote canyons, I almost said no. Something in his voice made me say yes. A ranger checked our plan and said there'd been mountain lion sightings and to watch the weather because flash floods were chewing up the Narrows. Dad nodded like he'd written the warnings himself. The first days were simple. Red rock, petroglyph panels he let me spot first, shade in alcoves where we rationed water. We heard distant thunder most afternoons, rumbling somewhere beyond the mesas. He walked steady, teaching without making it a lesson. I kept noticing odd boot prints that weren't ours. Once I thought I saw a cigarette butt in the sand. Then nothing. By the third night we had a rhythm, trading short sentences and long silences. He'd say, "You're setting a good pace, Sam," and it sounded like an apology for years of not saying much. We avoided Mom's name but carried it anyway. On the morning of day 4, we entered Spirit Canyon. Narrow walls, a ribbon of water. It felt safe because it was predictable. Dad kept glancing up canyon more than usual. When I asked why, he said, "Barometer's dropping." And then he stopped dead. A faint path cut away from the wash, just a few disturbed stones angling toward a pale bench. Dad tilted his head. "Someone's been using that." I wanted to stick to the route. 10 minutes tops, he said, and started up. The trail climbed in switchbacks between slabs that shifted underfoot. We topped out on a little plateau not much bigger than a studio apartment. That's where we saw them. It wasn't art, and it wasn't random. Bone and deadwood structures stood in a rough circle, chest high. Stones anchored lashings of yucca cord, ribs bent to hold frames, vertebrae strung like beads. The bones were bleached and scored with tooth marks, bigger than coyotes, more like lion kills, stripped and repurposed. Dad moved slow, then knelt by a crosspiece set into 2 uprights. He touched the wood and flinched. "Hands off," he said. Embedded along the grain were teeth, human teeth, shoved root first into little pockets, the wood grown tight around them. Some were molars, some canines, yellowed, cracked. He said, "These were set here on purpose." I asked by who, and he didn't answer. "We're leaving," he said. We dropped to the wash fast, stepping on stone, smoothing our prints where we could. Dad said no fire, no lights, and we'd camp near running water for sound cover. We found a creek under cottonwoods and set the tent low profile. He had me stack packs inside the door and hung the food line anyway, saying habit. We ate cold tortillas and peanut butter. He did a slow perimeter with the red lens and said he'd take first watch, which told me everything. After midnight, rocks clicked together beyond the cottonwoods. Soft, slow, not a roll, more like testing. The steps moved around us in a loose circle. I mouthed, "Cat?" He shook his head, tapped 2 fingers. "Human." He rested a hand on the bear spray, safety off. Once, something brushed the tent fly. A low exhale came from right outside like someone steadying a heavy pack. It went on and off. Eventually the sounds drifted off with the creek. First light showed camp wrong in small ways. The stove sat turned 90 degrees. My bootlaces were undone. The map wasn't folded how Dad folds, his squares replaced by triangles. On a flat rock by the water lay a pair of dog tags on a braided chain. Dad lifted them and went still. "Corporal Danny Rodriguez," he said. The chain was the square braid he'd taught his recon guys, a night watch show-off knot. Danny had gone missing in these canyons 7 years ago. I told him it could be some other Danny, some other braid. He shook his head. I taught him this pattern. He copied my sloppy loop here. He set the tags back like evidence. We're not debating this, he said. We packed fast and moved, keeping to rock, crossing on exposed stones, talking only to clarify turns. He glassed the rim every stop with his little monocular. Slow sweep, long pause on shadows. Nothing moved. By midday, thin high clouds dulled the sun and the wind picked up. He changed the plan, cut us toward a cattle trail he remembered, saying we'd aim for a dirt track and hitch if we had to. We leave spirit behind, he said. I kept replaying the teeth in the wood and the slow footsteps around the tent. Who carries dog tags and rearranges stoves and knows a knot a stranger wouldn't notice? We took one break under an overhang. He said, "If I say drop, drop. Don't ask." Late afternoon, we crested a rise that looked back through a notch toward that plateau. Dad lowered his pack very slowly, saying nothing. From here, the circle of structures was just jagged lines against the sky. I lifted a hand to block glare and saw a thin wisp of smoke rising, perfectly straight, from the middle of the ring. That evening, as I went down to the stream for water, I saw a silhouette on the rocks above. The figure was tall and bony with disproportionately long arms, standing perfectly still and watching us. I stood there until my hands hurt from gripping the bottles. When it shifted its weight, I turned. I walked back to camp without running, because running felt like inviting it closer. Dad read my face and didn't ask much. I told him anyway. The height, the arms, how it seemed off, like the joints were wrong. He believed me, which scared me more than if he laughed, and he started pulling gear without a speech. He took out a hatchet and a flare gun wrapped in a bandana. He checked the cartridges, handed me one from my pocket, and said, "Save it unless I say." We moved the tent into the boulder's shadow so our outline wouldn't pop. He taped the zipper pulls, killed the reflective cord, and broke the glow stick I'd hung. He set a shallow fire ring we weren't going to use and had me pocket the headlamp, lowest setting, no waving it around. We ate jerky, no stove. He showed me where he wanted me if something came in, where he'd be if it tried to circle. It wasn't dramatic. It felt like drill. Footsteps started after full dark, slow and deliberate, heel to toe, like somebody practicing human walking. They stopped near the tent, and a deep, steady breathing filled the space between the nylon and the night. A wet click came at the top of each inhale, mechanical and wrong. I gripped the hatchet and counted. Nothing touched the zipper. Then something small hit a rock next to our dead fire with a metallic clink. Dad rolled out, scooped it, and his breath changed, sharp. It was a unit patch, the same tan field with the skull and dagger I remembered from his old duffel. He whispered that 5 guys from his unit had vanished between 2010 and 2017, always alone, desert training areas, day hikes, no bodies. He'd mapped it, called families, tried to warn people. Nobody wanted to hear it, he said. I didn't want you mixed up in it. Then he went back to work like saying it emptied a backpack. He rigged a signal trap, a firecracker wedged between 2 rocks, a pulled fuse laid across a tight wire at shin height, line anchored to a 3rd rock. Flash buys seconds, he said. He dusted our footprints with a sleeve and set us back to back at the boulder, me toward the tent, him toward the approach. Around 2 a.m., gravel shifted upslope, then quiet, then that wet click farther off. He said, "We go. Leave the tent." We lifted straps, kept low, moved down canyon on stone where we could, headlamps pointed at our boots. We were maybe 100 yards out when the firecracker went. A hard crack, Then the fuse licked into dry grass and a thin sheet of flame flared across the ground. Rocks flashed white, then black. In that strobe, a shape stood at the edge of the fire, tall and too thin. Through the flames appeared a figure, skeletal with gray skin stretched over protruding ribs and a gaping jaw full of needle teeth. Instead of eyes, black hollows stared at us from a skull-like face. It folded sideways under a curl of flame like its shoulders didn't hinge the way ours do, and stepped into the wash like it knew the route. Dad fired the flare and hit it in the chest. The star stuck and burned. It didn't scream. It made the wet click again and kept coming. We ran hard. The steps behind us were heavy, not matching the thin frame, like mass was stacked somewhere else inside it. The canyon threw our breath and its sounds back, so distance was impossible. Dad called short commands: up, drop, hold, and I did them without thinking. We cleared a shelf, slid a chute, used elbows and knees when feet slipped. Twice the thing made a high sound that bored into my ears. We passed the spot where we'd camped, and something smelled scorched. Nylon or hair, I didn't look to see. At a choke where the wash narrowed between two wedged boulders, Dad shoved me through first, then rammed a dead log into the gap. A hand, or something like a hand, reached over and brushed my boot. The skin felt dry and cold and thin, like paper over wire. Dad buried the hatchet into the log to wedge it tighter, then yanked me by my strap, and we moved. The flare light behind us dimmed and disappeared. Pre-dawn thinned the darkness and the walls fell back. The wash became a ranch track with shallow ruts. We followed it to a cattle guard and a cracked signpost. My legs wobbled, feet numb. Dad didn't look back. He kept a steady pace and had me count steps to 70 and breathe on the sevens. When the ranger station finally showed, low roof, radio mast, one dusty truck, we didn't break into a run. We walked in like we belonged there so our hands wouldn't shake. Inside, Dad laid the patch and Danny's tags on the counter and said, "We need help up canyon." The ranger on duty didn't argue. He radioed, took our coordinates, handed us water, and wrote while Dad gave a clipped report. The ring, the teeth, the footsteps, the trap, the fire, the figure he refused to label. A search team rolled at first light. They came back late with ash on their boots and said the entire plateau had burned clean, down to mineral soil, like accelerant. But there's no fuel up there except bone and dead wood and sun. Dad stopped leading trips that fall. He sold extra gear, boxed maps, and wrote quiet letters to the families from his lost unit with whatever facts he had, and the places he'd avoid now. Years later, I still think about what we woke up in that place. Something sleeping in the deep desert until hunger made it stand. And the local tribes had stories about things that learn a shape because it works, and then drop it when it doesn't. And sometimes I wonder if we were lucky to escape, or if it just wasn't our time yet. I was 18 and had just moved away from Page, Arizona, where I'd lived my whole life on the edge of the Navajo reservation. Since Page is 60 miles from anywhere, locals hunt jackrabbit, coyote, and bobcat out on the dirt trails. I grew up on that. My uncle's 22 when I was a kid, then my own rifle when I got a job washing boats and saved up. This particular day about a year and a half ago, I was out hunting coyotes alone with my Springfield AR-15 loaded with American Eagle ammunition. Noon sun, dry air that makes everything sharp, and I'd wandered down into a wash that ran along the bottom of the sandstone cliffs. The plan was to skirt the shadows and watch for movement. Coyotes don't sit still when the heat shimmers like that. They make mistakes. I rounded a bend and something bolted, gray, big, hauling up the face like it had hands. I raised, squeezed, 3 shots in a controlled rhythm. I saw the second one take it. Meat hit. And the third went wide. It bled and kept climbing. The blood was wrong. Not a little spray, not the usual string of drops. It poured in a way I'd only seen after somebody hit a deer's artery. I didn't like that, but I didn't back off either. I slung the rifle, dug fingers into the rock, and climbed. It took me maybe 4 minutes to top out, and I was completely winded. The kind of ragged breathing you get when your chest cramps and you try not to cough because coughing wastes air. My ammunition is powerful enough to drop a mountain lion if you place it right. So this much blood from a coyote didn't make sense. Up top, the cliff turned to flat ground with knee-high shrubs and dried bushes, a scrim of gray-green and old sticks. No coyote in sight, which was strange given how heavy it was bleeding. I wasn't guessing. There was a trail like someone walked around with a leaking paint can. I put fresh eyes on everything that mattered. Wind, line of sight, any movement in the brush, where I'd have to retreat if something charged. Then I started following the blood, slow and steady. Rifle up but off safe. Finger nowhere near the trigger because I wasn't going to ND myself out there like an idiot. I expected a body within minutes. Coyotes don't run long on a wound like that. 10 minutes. 15. 20. The drops didn't thin out. They got thicker, smeared across rocks, speckled the shrubs, dragged over a stone like a handprint. I knelt once to touch a wet patch, and it came away bright, not dried, which meant I was close, closer than felt smart. That's when concern actually elbowed in. Too much blood for any coyote to cover that distance without dropping. I kept moving because you don't leave a wounded animal suffering if you can help it. But I changed how I moved. Shorter steps, heel first to feel soft ground, checking 6 every few seconds. The trail was painting everything as it went. About 30 minutes since the shots, something made my blood run cold. The coyote tracks I'd been following weren't alone anymore. They met up with what looked like goat tracks in the sand. Fresh. Deep. The loose sand was still collapsing in around them when I got down to take a close look. Not domestic goat. These had a spread that looked wrong and a weight that said heavy. The coyote prints were sharp and desperate, angled claws from climbing, pads splayed. The goat prints, if that's what they were, cut right alongside. Both recent. Both headed the same direction for a bit. I stood up and scanned the horizon. Just shrubs and that dead flat light that makes distance weird. I didn't like any of it. This was where I knew I needed to get the hell out of there fast. I said out loud, "Nope," just to break the silence. I started to pivot back toward the cliff edge, already plotting the safest route down without turning my back for too long. Because whatever bled like that either wasn't a coyote anymore, or I'd badly misread something that could get me hurt. Then the tracks split apart. The coyote went far off to the left, a clear peel into the scrub like it was trying to give anything else the slip. The goat prints headed right. That alone would have been fine. I'd chalk it up to 2 animals crossing paths. Day ruined. Go home. But the blood trail didn't follow the coyote anymore. It followed the goat prints. Not a mistake. Not one weird splash. The heavy blood, fat drops, smears, those dragging streaks, shifted and lined up with the hooves heading right. I froze hard. I remember bracing the rifle, not pointing at anything. Just bracing like you do when you need both hands steady and your legs feel rubbery. I stared at the sand, at the prints, at the way the blood left the dog's shape and went to the other. It looked like the blood had decided which feet it wanted to follow. That's not how anything works. I crouched and traced the edges with a gloved finger to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks in that glare. The coyote's pads kept going left, lighter now, but still running. The blood was with the hooves. The goat prints angled toward another wash I knew by reputation. bad place. Locals avoided it. Not a tourist rumor, not a ghost story for kids, just don't go in there, passed down with real names and real reasons nobody wrote down. Washes out there carry more than water when it finally rains. They carry trash, dead cattle, sometimes worse. This one had a history. I took a breath and checked my phone out of habit, even though I knew I didn't have service on that mesa. The screen just showed time and a battery icon. I remember thinking about my grandpa's friend telling me once, "If it feels wrong out there, it is." I eased backward 2 slow steps, trying not to disturb the sand more than I had to. The wind shifted, a weird cool draft that didn't match the sun, and I smelled iron again, which was stupid because blood smell is faint in heat. But there it was anyway, like a penny pressed to your tongue. I kept the rifle low, safety still on, because popping off into nothing wasn't going to help me if I tripped. I looked left along the coyote path and saw the tracks getting lighter, then disappearing into hardpack. I looked right along the goat prints and saw the blood darken again where the trail dipped, like something bled harder every few yards. Now, before I explain what happened next, you need to understand the kind of talk that floats around Page and the res edges. People say Wendigo up here like folks say boogeyman, and strangers think it's just a spooky word from the internet. But the old guys don't use it to scare kids. They use it to explain what happens when something stops being an animal and stops being a person and turns into something else because of hunger and bad choices. The Navajo have their own stories for that. Don't run at night. Don't follow tracks into places the wind doesn't touch. Don't pick up what isn't yours. Rules that are there 'cause someone broke them once and didn't come back. I'm not claiming I saw anything on 2 legs or 4, and I'm not pretending to be an expert in anyone's culture. I'm telling you I stood there looking at hooves stamped deep and blood that had no business changing feet, leading straight into a wash. People avoided for reasons that had names, and I felt like I'd stumbled into one of those stories. The locals always said Wendigos could take different shapes, starting as one animal and becoming another. Some said it was just hunger with legs. Staring at a blood trail that left coyote tracks and picked up hooves, I realized I might be tracking something that wasn't a coyote. The wash ahead was known for disappearances and weird night noises. My grandfather, part Navajo, warned me about places where tracks change and blood doesn't follow rules. I backed away from the sign, rifle ready, eyes on the cliffs. The silence was wrong. No birds, no bugs. Whatever I hit wasn't behaving like an animal. The stories said these things lead hunters into bad ground, and I wasn't giving it the chance. I didn't run. Running gets you hurt. I did a slow retreat, heel to toe, rifle low, scanning. Checked the mag by feel, round chambered, safety on. Tried to catch normal sound, 1 cicada, 1 raven, but it was wind in shrubs and an iron taste I couldn't explain. Every 20 steps I stopped and listened. Nothing. I pressed my palm to the sand for vibration and felt only my pulse. The goat prints with their heavy blood angled toward the bad wash and I let them go. I tied a strip from a shop rag on a scrub root so I wouldn't circle back, then eased toward the drop I knew. Before the descent, I did the checklist my grandfather drilled. What's behind you? What's above you? How do you leave if your legs stop? Behind me, open flat, then the cliff. Above, hard sky. Way out, same route down. I sat on the lip, slung the rifle, and took the holds in reverse, breathing through my teeth to hear. Halfway down I looked back, just shrubs and a ribbon of dark dots where the blood crossed. No body, no coyote, no goat, just a mess and a place that wanted me in it. At the bottom I stayed on the firm edge, not the soft middle. I moved fast toward the truck. I got back to my truck fast, checking over my shoulder. It felt like the coyote, or whatever it was, wanted me to follow, like it staged that blood to pull me into the quiet spot. I kept the muzzle down, slid in, locked up, started the engine, and exhaled. I watched the mirrors along the wash line and saw only heat shimmer. I set the rifle on the passenger floor with the ejection port up, safety on, and counted rounds to steady my hands. I drove to the highway slower than I wanted, because blowing a tire while panicked gets people stuck. Once the tires hit asphalt, the steering went smooth, and only then did I feel how tight my shoulders were. That night I called my grandfather and laid out what I'd seen without leaning on the supernatural part. I told him about the size, the 3 shots, the blood, the climb, the split where hooves picked up the bleeding. He let me talk and said, "Stay away from that place." I said I already left. He said, "Don't hunt alone near those washes again. Some things aren't meant to be tracked or cornered." I said I wasn't going back. He asked what ammo I used. I told him. He sounded tired. We were quiet. He told me to toss the rag and not bring that sand inside. We hung up. Since then, I've heard other hunters talk about similar runs. Wounded animals leaving impossible blood trails that jump tracks or thicken when the path narrows like something once you funneled. Guys I trust describe being drawn along by silence and how time gets strange when you're staring at tracks. One buddy backed out after a mule deer bleed started showing cat pads. He swears he heard rocks tap behind him like knuckles. I'm not saying what it is out there. The reservation has stories about wendigos that shapeshift and lure people deeper because hunger is patient and smart. I never went back to that wash, and I don't hunt alone anymore in those parts. Whatever I tracked that day, it was something that understood how to use a hunter's instincts against them. So, when I was 28, my brother Kevin disappeared in Black Canyon Gorge in Washington State forests with his client Mark Hollis during a winter trekking expedition. 4 days after they vanished, Pierce County Search and Rescue started their operation. Instead of joining the main group, I assembled my own team. Joe White Cloud, a tracker from the Kino tribe, State Police Sergeant Mike Roders, and local guide Dave. We rode ATVs before dawn, pushing through thick fog that shrouded the mountain slopes. 3 hours of riding brought us to the edge of Black Canyon, a place known for steep descents, unstable slopes, and unpredictable weather. Kevin's GPS signal had last pinged somewhere deep in the gorge. The terrain was treacherous for experienced outdoorsmen like my brother. We idled a minute while the fog slid past our boots. Joe tapped the map and traced a line he thought would hold. Mike logged our time and tried the radio. Nothing but static. Dave watched the mist churn out of the firs and said if we didn't start down now, we'd be sleeping up here. I told them we'd go slow. We dropped in low gear. Engines roared on the steep cuts, then bucked as we threaded fallen logs and rock slides. Joe signaled wide around fresh slough where the clay peeled like wet paper. Mike cursed at static. Dave called out washouts and counted seconds between us so nobody vanished into the soup. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No bird calls, no wind through branches, just engine noise, and then the sudden dead silence when we killed it to listen. Joe stopped his ATV and stared into the fog-wrapped canyon for a long moment. He said the place felt wrong, that his people avoided it for generations, calling it the place the earth rejects. Mike tried to make a joke about superstitions, but Joe ignored him and addressed me. If your brother ended up here voluntarily, he had serious reasons. We kept descending. Now, before I explain what happened next, you need to understand Kevin's style. He didn't leave anything to chance. He logged fuel, kept redundancies, and he never, ever walked away from a machine with the keys in. He'd say habits keep you alive. I was thinking about that when Dave lifted a hand and pointed down canyon. Headlights, he said. We eased into a small valley where the fog hung low and saw them. 3 ATVs sat in a tight triangle, nose to nose, headlights still glowing weak through the mist. No scattered gear. No churned gravel like somebody spun in panic. Just that triangle, neat as a diagram, centered on a bare patch of rock. I cut my engine and climbed off. The air felt heavier without the motors. Kevin's machine was on the left. His keys were still in the ignition, gas tank half full, which didn't match his usual careful style. Dave said, "That's not him," like saying it would fix it. Mike keyed his mic and reported what we had. The net spat a clipped syllable and died. Joe crouched and ran 2 fingers across the gravel. He found tracks from 2 men leading away from the vehicles, calm steps with no signs of panic or running. He showed me the spacing and the heel set, the way the toes didn't dig. 2, he said. No third. If it was Kevin and Mark who walked out of here, why leave with no gear, no notes, no markers? We followed the prints. They threaded between boulders and over a deadfall scuffed smooth by boots, crossed a drift of sand with crisp edges, and ran toward a shallow, brush-lined ravine. No blood, no drag marks, no scuffle. It looked like people taking a walk they didn't plan to return from. Dave kept glancing back at the triangle. Mike said the main team should have reached the upper spur by now, but he kept pace. At the ravine, the tracks just ended at the lip. Not smeared by roots, not faded out on stone. They ended. Mike swore and slid down with his flashlight to examine the bottom. Solid ground, packed mud, no signs of falling or struggle down there at all. He swept the beam side to side and then up at us. Nothing, he said. Like they stepped off the edge and didn't land. I looked for a jump rock or a clean landing spot. Anything that explained a choice. There was nothing but brush and flat mud. Joe moved along the rim, reading the ground. Something wiped them clean, he said. This place never belonged to humans anyway. Mike climbed back up, unhappy, and Dave asked if floodwater could do that. It hadn't rained in days. Light was dying and fog makes dark come early. We made camp on higher ground with good visibility, backs to a rock wall. We set a perimeter with cord and stacked a fire from dead wood we'd brought along. Dave checked the GPS against the map. The last ping sat inside a 100-yard circle that touched our boots. The radio cracked once, then went quiet. We logged time and location in a notebook. We didn't argue about going deeper at night. Joe told us to stay inside the cord, no exceptions. He wouldn't sit. He walked the perimeter and then, without ceremony, performed some kind of ritual, scattering something from a small pouch at the 4 corners of our camp while he whispered under his breath. Mike watched skeptically, arms folded, and Dave paced nervously. After the others fell asleep, I asked Joe what his ancestors knew about this place. He stared at the coals and said they called it the Shadow Eater, an old hunger that sleeps in deep places until somebody wakes it up, and sometimes it wakes up hungry. He wasn't trying to scare me. He said it like a weather report. I was going to argue, like okay, sure. But Dave jolted up with a strangled noise and pointed past me into the timber. He kept saying there was a tall figure moving between the trees, just inside the dark where the firelight didn't reach. We grabbed lights and swept the perimeter, slow and methodical, following the cord we'd strung. Nothing. Just shadow columns and our own breath. Mike said, "It's your nerves, man," and told Dave to hydrate and lie back down because we had miles to do. But Joe stood facing the same patch of black and didn't move for a long time. The fire snapped. No wind, no night birds, just that slow, heavy quiet that makes you talk softer without knowing why. At first light, we packed fast and headed down slope. The air felt thicker with every step, heavy like standing in a closed garage, trees locked in tighter until our shoulders brushed wet bark. Joe took lead. I stayed on him, and Mike watched our rear, counting. Dave kept scanning up. About 15 feet above us, between the branches, we saw the bones. Not scattered, placed. Dry white ribs laid like ladders, skulls wedged in crooks, long leg bones bridged across limbs. There were no scraps of hide or stink. Whoever did it had time and hands and a reason. Dave said, "No way that's natural." And Mike agreed fast, which coming from him told me enough. Joe didn't speak. He stepped under one of the bigger clusters and stared, then stepped back out like he'd crossed a line he didn't want to be inside. Joe went pale and said these were territorial markers and that we were inside somebody's boundary already. He refused to go any farther into the gorge. He wasn't dramatic about it. He laid out the risk like a list. Missing men, quiet woods, arranged bones, footprints that ended, and said the math didn't work. We needed to pull back and call in more bodies with long guns and dogs. I said Kevin could be bleeding out 100 yards away and I wasn't walking out. Mike sided with me, not because he liked me, but because he couldn't write "turned around at bones" in a report if a client was dead in this draw. Joe said, then split, and he and Dave would hold here and keep a hot camp and a line on the ridge for signal. We pushed another ridge over, just me and Mike, checking every depression and snag pile. 10 minutes in, he smelled it first. That cold, sweet rot that cuts through everything. And we found Mark Hollis, half buried in wet earth under a leaning stump. He was curled tight like he'd tried to fold into himself. His eyes were open and the skin on his face was pulled so hard it showed his teeth. No animal tears, no scatter. Just pressed into mud like he'd lain down and the forest stamped him. We didn't dig. Mike photographed, logged GPS, clipped a sample from his pack strap, and called it in. The radio gave us only fuzz. We marked it with tape and started back slow, backs to each other for the first 100 feet. That night the footsteps came. Not sneaking, slow and heavy, pacing the edge of the firelight like it knew exactly where the glow ended. We kept the flames stacked high and sat facing out with lights in our laps. Joe said not to waste the beams sweeping, make it come closer if it wanted us. It didn't. It just circled and paused and circled again, and once a bone clicked above us like something adjusted weight high in the canopy. Nobody slept. Dave muttered that he didn't see a face, he just saw height, like a person stretched wrong. Mike told him to stop feeding it. I counted loops, 4, maybe 5. Then it faded. No branches snapped. Just gone. At first light again, frost on the cords, we found tracks outside our perimeter that hadn't been there the night before. Joe studied them and went quiet. Then he looked at me and said, "These are your brothers." The left toe scuffed the way Kevin's did after his ankle injury last spring. They led up slope into a thick grove, straight as a string, no meander like a confused person. I said his name once and got my own voice back from the trees. Then I heard him, thin and hollow, but him, called Dennis, not a shout, just the way he said it when he wanted me to come look at something quick. I moved before anyone could argue. Mike grabbed my sleeve and said, "Wait for a plan. We don't chase a voice into a choke point," and he was right. But it was Kevin, and I told him we'd lose it if we stalled. Joe said, "Do not answer it." But I'd already stepped into the brush, pushing aside wet limbs, tasting dirt off the leaves. The grove closed behind me like a door. The ground under my boots went from duff to slick clay, and the air felt colder in my chest. The voice called again, closer now, same syllables. "Dennis, just a little cleaner." I pushed through into a small clearing, not even 10 paces across, with a fallen log and a dark seam in the bank like a crack leading nowhere. A figure stood near the log. It wore Kevin's jacket and his hat, and the angle of his shoulders hit me like a hammer because it was right. But the arms hung too long and the stance had a strange sway. Too careful, like it was copying weight shift without knowing why. It turned. The face looked like him if you didn't look long. Then the features didn't hold. Eyes set just a little off, mouth a half beat behind. It lifted a hand and opened its mouth and said my name again. And the sound was closer to perfect this time, like it had been practicing until it got the tone just right. During the summer of 2019, me and my friends decided to go camping at Tomlinson Run near Pittsburgh. It was muggy and gray, and they were calling for heavy rain, so we skipped the tents and rented one of those little round-wall cabins with 4 bunks and a loft, no electricity, just a door latch that stuck and thin windows. We set up at the fire pit behind the cabin by the tree line, cracked a few beers, and kept the fire low cause the ranger had warned us about sparks and dry brush, even though the sky looked like a soaked blanket. As evening pinned down, the canopy kept most of the rain off, and we got lazy about packing up, just talking about work stuff, and who was bringing breakfast, and whether we'd hike the rim trail if it cleared. Alex got up to take a piss, said he'd be right back, and walked off toward the black gap where the trail cut through. We pulled our folding chairs closer to the cabin and slid the cooler inside the door so nothing got soaked. I was raking the fire down to coals to save the wood, and James was stuffing the bags under the table, and everything felt routine until Alex's tone changed. He said, very flat and too loud, "Inside. Now." And when we looked up, he was not joking. His face had that locked look like he was tracking something he didn't want to name. We didn't ask questions. We just grabbed the chairs and the last beer and hustled into the cabin because you do that when a friend you trust uses that voice. The door stuck and then slammed, and Alex was there 10 seconds later, flipping the latch and shoving the little table against it like that would help. He said he'd seen a wolf pacing us at the tree line, long body low, watching the fire and then tracking him when he moved. We all said what you're probably thinking. There aren't wolves out here. And he said, "Then it's the biggest coyote I've ever seen." And he wasn't smiling. It set the mood. We turned off the lantern to kill the reflection on the windows and sat listening to the rain hammer the leaves and then soften. Every few minutes one of us would say we were being stupid and then shut up because outside felt busy in a way that didn't match the weather. Around 2 in the morning I woke to the door snatching open and then banging shut again, and for a second I thought someone had broken in. But it was just James sprinting from the stoop. He was shaking like he'd run a mile at speed. He kept saying he was sorry and then getting stuck on words. He'd gone outside to pee and heard a howl. Not the cartoon kind either. Deep, like it started in a barrel and rolled out. He turned and saw someone standing between the trees. Not on all fours, on 2 feet. Hands like claws, he said. I thought it was going to run me down. He wasn't drunk enough to make it funny. We shut the door again, and he slid to the floor with his back against it like he was trying to hold the whole night out with his spine. I took the upper bunk on the back wall and pulled the ladder up to jam it as a rail. Not that it would stop anything that actually wanted up there, but it felt like I'd done something. The windows were on 3 sides. You could see trees from everywhere. Being up top put my eyes level with the back pane that looked straight out to the tree line. I stared at that window so much it started to feel like I was waiting for a clock to chime. Every scrape of a branch sounded like a step. Every little draft felt like someone testing the gaps around the frame. James muttered that he could still hear that low howl in his head. Alex kept repeating that it was probably just a coyote, and then not finishing the sentence. Now, before I explain what I did next, you need to understand I wasn't trying to be brave. I wanted to know what was there so we didn't make a dumb choice like opening the door at the wrong second. The fire had burned down and the rain had thinned to a steady tap, so whatever was outside would hear us if we moved around too much. Alex whispered up, "You good?" And I said, "Yeah." But my stomach felt wrong in that way where your body is paying attention before your head admits it. I rolled over slow, keeping my shoulder against the wall so the bunk wouldn't creak, and angled my face toward the glass. That's when I saw it crouched low with its back to me, exactly where the trees begin, hunched like it was studying the ground. For half a second my brain said, "Hiker, stupid poncho, some guy sheltering, because you bargain with yourself like that." Then the head turned all the way around without the shoulders moving, just this smooth rotation like it was checking behind it, and the eyes hit the glass. They reflected, not bright like a flashlight, just a dull catch of the clouded moon, and everything in me went rigid like I'd grabbed a live wire. I didn't shout because instinct said don't. I pressed my forearm against the ladder and kept my breath small. "Do you see something?" Alex whispered, and I didn't answer because I didn't want to give it a sound to map. It blinked slow. It didn't flinch at the rain or shift like an animal would. It watched, and that felt worse than teeth. I couldn't see a mouth. I could see length, arms too long for the crouch, the angles not lining up with what you expect from joints. I breathed through my nose and willed the bunk not to creak. James whispered that we should call the ranger, then hissed that we had no service, which we all already knew. Alex was already holding the hatchet we'd used for kindling, not waving it, just bracing. It unfolded. That's the only word I have for it. It stood and it kept standing until my reference points got stupid. Maybe 8 feet. Maybe more. It was thin like a runner who never eats, and it was wrong in motion even before it moved, just holding there like balance didn't apply. Alex was below me whispering, "Tell me," over and over, and I said, "Don't move," and meant don't breathe, don't cough, don't touch the door. Then it ran. Not a jump scare lunge, not a wildlife bolt. It just went, clean, like it had been waiting for its cue, crossed the little slice of open ground, and cut into the trees at a speed that made my brain miscount the steps, faster than any human could run, like an Olympic final, but with all the mechanics shaved down to nothing. The way it moved was predatory and fluid, not like any person I'd ever seen run. We packed at first light without talking, stuffing damp bags into tubs and folding chairs while the coals looked like old teeth. Nobody wanted breakfast. Alex dragged the cooler to the car. James kept the keys on the table like a stopwatch. And we checked the cabin twice, latched the door, and left without looking back, because the tree line felt like it was waiting for an excuse. Once the car doors shut, the quiet felt like a lid. I pulled onto the park road and finally said what I'd seen from the top bunk, the head turning without the shoulders, the height when it stood, the way it moved like it had trained for it. Alex didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I saw when I went to pee the first night." He hadn't wanted to blow the trip up, so he said wolf, because that sounded like a problem we could manage. James nodded without looking up and said the same thing. Something on 2 feet by the trees after that low, wrong howl, standing like it wanted to be seen. We rolled past the ranger station, and it didn't make anything feel normal. We didn't report it because what would we even say that wouldn't get an eye roll and a form to fill out? We just wanted distance and other cars. On the highway, Alex said, 2 nights. It watched us 2 nights. Like he was logging the fact. He said he'd felt eyes before the rain even started, pacing the edge of the firelight and testing how close it could get. We've camped there for years. We know fox screams and barred owls and dumb raccoons. This wasn't that. Tomlinson Run and the hollows around it have a history if you look past brochures. A teenager vanished near the reservoir. A bow hunter found torn up off-trail. A dog that came home with a ripped ear and wouldn't face the woods. Alex said the word without drama. Wendigo. His grandfather used it for a hunger that changes you. Men trapped in winters who did the worst thing and never came back. Just something wearing them after. He said the way ours watched felt like a plan, not just a predator. James said the eyes looked like a person still in there. I kept us at the limit and didn't stop until a gas station outside East Liverpool, where we stood in fluorescent light until our hands quit shaking. We all agreed on one thing without saying it. No second night, no splitting up. I dropped Alex, then James. We skipped the usual text when you get in. We just said, "Lock up," and meant it. I pulled into my driveway and left the tote in the trunk, went inside, and turned on the kitchen, hall, and bedroom lights. Call it whatever you want. It made the walls feel thicker. I slept in jolts and kept checking the backyard from the kitchen window, like the wood line could leak into a neighborhood if you let it. I researched Wendigo sightings in western Pennsylvania when I got home and found reports that matched what we'd seen. 8-foot figures moving faster than any person should, posted at the tree line like they were studying camps. The same phrases showed up. Intelligence behind the eyes, decisions being made, a head turning all the way around while the body stayed still. There were forum threads from hunters, a trail runner who quit mid-loop and walked the road back, a night shift guy who stopped using his shortcut after something paced him. None of it sounded like people chasing a legend. It sounded like people who wanted normal again. I haven't gone back to that cabin or those woods. Walking my street at night, when a motion light pops on or a head shifts, I feel the same weight I felt on that top bunk, and I keep my eyes ahead because I don't want to give it anything useful. It marked us those 2 nights, not with a scratch or a symbol, just attention, and I don't think it's forgotten. Once something like that has seen you, really seen you, it never completely lets you go. About 20 years ago now, I'd been ice fishing Lake Winnipesaukee every winter for 42 years, usually with my wife Doris, but more often alone in recent years. The lake stretched for miles, its bays and channels forming a complex network of frozen waterways in central New Hampshire. Doris preferred the warm months at our cabin by the shore, but last fall Alzheimer's took her, leaving me alone with memories and silence. This winter, solitude became a necessity, a way to cope with the emptiness of home and find peace in ice fishing rituals. I loaded my snowmobile with an auger, a small propane heater, a rolled canvas shelter, a bedroll, canned food, and a thermos of coffee that was too strong for most people, not for me. My destination was Devil's Teeth, a torn necklace of low islands that always sits away from weekend crowds. Morning sun flattened the lake into a hard white plain, and it felt like the right place to be. Because out here, the tasks tell you what to do next, and there's no space for anything except doing them right. The ride was familiar, across the main channel, skirting the pressure ridge that snakes by the bay mouth, then set a line toward the eastern shore of the largest island. I cut power there, stepped off, and did the thing I always do before I trust any ice with my weight. I chopped with the spud, listened, and counted. 22 inches. Black ice under wind-burnished crust. That number takes the edge off. In half an hour, I drilled a 6-inch hole, skimmed off the slush, and staked the canvas so the door faced leeward. The heater threw a polite blue flame. I rigged a jig, sat with my back to the cot frame, and let the quiet stack up in manageable layers. Ice noise, heater tick, a gull somewhere far off. Meals were beans, crackers, beef jerky, and coffee you could use to clean a carburetor. I read an old detective paperback and made a few notes in a spiral about wind direction, barometer, and how the auger bit felt in the first 2 feet. No romance in it, just records to keep you honest. The first 2 days were straight lines. Drop, wait, reel, unhook. Keep a pair of decent ones cold on the ice. Let the small stuff and the weird stuff go. I moved once to a contour edge and picked up a lazy pickerel, which I didn't need, so back he went. For the first time in months, I woke and didn't dread the hours between waking and sleep. On the third morning, I took the sled along the chain of neighboring islands, not far, just enough to check a narrow point that's produced since before the auger went to gas. I drilled test holes, ran the sounder, marked a good drop, and pulled a few honest perch, fat enough for a pan but not worth bragging about. By late afternoon, the sky went to heavy gray and the temperature snapped down a couple notches. Wind scoured the snow off patches of ice until they shone like old glass. I packed it in early to be safe. Deep in the night, a sound woke me. Not the normal ticks and little rifle cracks you get when the cold really sits in. This had a pattern. Slow and deliberate, like someone taking careful steps on bare ice. I lay still with the bag zipped to my chest and listened. The heater had burned out and the cold had that stiff bite that turns canvas to board. The steps came again. Crunch, pause, crunch, close to the door, close enough that for a second, I thought I'd see a shadow bleed through the fabric. They stopped. Nothing then. No breath. No cough. Just the tiny rub of a line against a grommet when the wind slid around the island. I held my breath without meaning to and counted to 20. Still nothing. When I let the air out, the steps started again, moved past the door, and took a slow arc around the shelter. Now, before I say what I did next, you need to understand, I don't throw a door open on an unknown at night out there. People get themselves hurt trying to prove a point to nobody. I went low and slid to the little viewing flap I'd sewn beside the tie-down years ago. A hand-sized square of cloudy plastic so you can take a look without advertising that you're doing it. I peeled the corner back and put my eye to the gap. The ice outside lay empty and silver, wind burnished to a shine. Nothing broke that field. No sled, no gear, no person, no dog. But the footsteps kept circling, steady as a metronome, slow as someone counting off pace for measuring. Every so often they'd stop for longer than was comfortable. I listened for breathing in those spaces and heard nothing except the faint hiss of wind. I set the door zipper so I could yank it fast if I had to. The steps came up close on the wall by the cot, and the canvas shifted in that particular way it does when a body blocks enough wind to change the tension. I said, "Hey there," low and even, because sometimes simple is safest. No answer. I tried, "You all right?" Same nothing. The pacing continued, methodical, along the back where the heater box sits, then along the door, then past the cot again. I imagined a tape measure coming out, which made no sense and made perfect sense at the same time. And when I caught myself imagining dumb things, I stopped and focused on keeping my hands still. 20 minutes, maybe 30. I stayed at the flap with one eye on the same bare ice and my ears telling me different. I thought about flicking the headlamp on behind the plastic, but I pictured a startled stumble and a skull hitting hard, mine or theirs, and I left it dark. My knees went cold from crouching. I counted the beats between steps to have something to do that wasn't panic, and the numbers did their job. The rhythm held and then changed, not in speed, but in direction. You can hear angle on ice if you've listened long enough. The steps turned away. They headed off toward the smaller islands, across that wind-scrubbed lane I'd ridden in daylight. I pressed my eye to the gap and saw exactly what I'd been seeing the whole time. Nothing moving. The sound got smaller and smaller, then went out like someone slowly closed a door a long way off. I stayed where I was until my knees complained loud enough to make the decision for me. I didn't call out again. There wasn't anything smart left to say, and I wasn't going to add my voice to the quiet just to hear it. I didn't sleep anymore. I laced my boots and pulled my coat on. I primed the heater so fire would catch quick if I needed it. I sat on the cot with the headlamp in my pocket and my gloves tucked under my thigh so I wouldn't lose them, and every so often I put my eye to the flap, then put a thumb on the door zipper, then checked the flap again. The canvas went from coal dark to ash, and then to a thin gray I could almost call morning, and I stayed there, waiting for dawn and wondering what it could have been. Morning brought me outside to examine the area, where I discovered clear prints in the snow. Large, bare footprints pressed deep into the crust, forming a perfect circle around the shelter. What made my blood freeze was that the track started suddenly in the middle of open ice and ended just as abruptly a few steps from where they began. No trail led to or from them, like something had materialized from thin air, walked around my shelter, and vanished. I crouched and measured with my glove, longer than my boot by a good 3 inches, narrow at the heel, toes defined like a person had walked barefoot in night temperatures that cracked steel. I checked for wind scours, for sastrugi that could trick the eye. The pattern was clean. I stood still long enough for the cold to reach my knees and forced myself to move because standing and staring wasn't helping. I tried the Coast Guard channel, then Marine Patrol, then the weather loop just to hear a voice. The speaker gave me steady hiss with a slow rise and fall that sounded too much like breathing. I swapped batteries, ran the antenna up, stepped away from the shelter frame, said my name, said devil's teeth, said I'd found something I couldn't explain. Nothing came back. My phone read no service. I walked toward the low rock point and held it high anyway because sometimes you catch a bar if you get lucky with line of sight. No bars. The prints sat there like a dare. I didn't step on them. I didn't take pictures. No service to send them and no point, and decided to get my head out of the circle by going to look at something I understood. I saddled up and rode to check Charlie Miller's old shack on the next island over. Charlie and I go back a long way. Lately he's been in Massachusetts more, helping with his daughter's baby, but he still sent photos and a thumbs up. His shack sits in the lee of a point that drifts the snow into a long stripe you can spot if you know what you're looking for. My old track was half buried under a skin. I eased off the throttle early so I could see the front without throwing snow. From 20 yards the wall looked wrong. Board edges were splayed outward like ribs, splinters bright against tired paint. I didn't rush the door. I walked a slow circle, eyes down. No fresh prints, no drag marks, no sled scars cutting away into the basin. Just old boot holes hardened by cold and a smooth apron of drift against the sill. I pushed the door with 2 fingers, then opened it just wide enough to step through. Inside was chaos. Folding chair legs bent sideways. The cot bowed in the middle. Bedding shredded into long strips that hung off bolt heads and hinges. Dark stains had frozen across the floor and up the walls in wide, smeared bands that looked like pressure and movement, not spray. And yet all of Charlie's gear sat untouched. Rods leaned in the corner with lines still threaded through the guides. Tackle boxes closed and latched. The heater upright with the valve turned off. Lantern on its hook. Wallet on the shelf with a rubber band around folded bills and a gas receipt. No body. No glass. No smashed heater. Violence like a storm trapped inside 4 walls and nothing stolen. Charlie? I said it once because not saying it felt like quitting on him. The echo sounded wrong, so I said it softer the second time. No answer. I checked under the bent cot out of habit. Checked behind the heater. Checked the little bin where he kept dry socks. Nothing. Back outside, I looked again for prints I might have missed. Same story. Mine going in and out, and a curl of drift slipping over them like the lake wanted fresh paper. At the sled, I keyed the radio again while keeping the torn wall in view, because it felt important to be looking at it while I talked. Static came back with that wobble on top, not a voice, not anything helpful. I climbed the rock point where sometimes you can steal a bar. No service. I recorded a message anyway because sometimes they send later. My name, the island chain, what I'd seen, that I was returning to my shelter and leaving at first light if the ice held. I put the phone in an inner pocket to keep the battery warm and rode out slow. The ride back was steady because the light was already flattening, and that's when you miss bad seams. When my canvas came into view, I did the math. If I tried to cross the basin now, one hidden pressure ridge or a current cut would take me under. If I held and left at daybreak, I could see the tells before they killed me. I've pulled 2 men off rotten edges near current, and I wasn't going to be the third with nobody to throw a rope. I cut the engine and slid in so the sled nose blocked the door. I moved through the checklist because checklists keep you from doing dumb things. Auger across the door base with the teeth down. Spare propane tank wedged behind it. Toolbox stacked on top to pin everything. Heater fittings checked. Matches and lighter set where my right hand would find them without searching. I taped the little window flap from the inside so anything trying to look in would have to scrape first. The ice spud went by the cot. The fillet knife went in my coat pocket, not to play tough, just to have something if a hand reached in. I ate jerky I didn't want and drank coffee that tasted like metal. I spoke once, low and plain, like I was setting terms. Name's Frank, leaving at first light. The wind pressed the canvas, then let it go. Far off, the main channel boomed twice. I kept my boots laced, gloves under my thigh, headlamp around my neck but dark, heater off so sound would carry clean. I watched the last light bleed out of the seams and learned every draft line by touch until I could point to the door by the colder ribbon along that edge. I barricaded the door with gear and prepared for the longest night of my life, knowing something was coming back for me. Way back in 2005, I was living in my home state of Maryland, which is full of unexplainable and supernatural things that even the Amish fear. It was a cool autumn evening, and I slipped out onto the porch of our place by the lake while my family stayed inside with drinks and loud music. I preferred the quiet. The water was flat enough to mirror the moon, except for the ripples from carp rolling near the reeds. Leaves skittered over the planks, and a fox cut through the yard toward the cattails. I sat on the top step and let the night settle, just watching the moon's reflection shake when the wind nudged it. Nothing about it felt strange until I noticed the porch swing chain tick once when the air was still, and my grandfather's toolbox wasn't where I'd left it earlier. It was angled wrong, like someone had dragged it a few inches with a toe. I leaned forward to look through the gaps between the boards, but it was just darkness and lake smell, and that was it, or so I told myself. Coyotes howled far off across dark water. I sat on the top step and let the night settle, just watching the moon's reflection shake when the wind nudged it. Nothing felt off until the porch swing chain ticked once when the air was dead, and my grandfather's toolbox wasn't where I'd left it earlier. It was angled wrong, like someone dragged it a few inches with a toe. I leaned forward to peer through the gaps between boards, saw nothing but dark. Now, layout. The porch is 3 feet, lattice on 3 sides, open at the steps, and the lattice is loose at the corner from raccoons. The first noise came from directly under me, not out in the yard. A deep snarl rolled up through the floorboards like a bass note, and I felt it in my shoes first. I froze. Then metal clanked, loud and messy, wrenches knocking wrenches, the coffee can of nails tipping, wood sliding. Something heavy shifted against a joist with a scrape, like nails dragging across brick. It thudded toward the loose corner. squeezed out, and the footsteps dropped onto soil behind the porch. Steps headed into the backyard, not running. I didn't breathe. I turned because I had to know. Slowly. In the pale moonlight, something stood by the old clothesline. It took my brain to line it up with anything I knew, and it failed. It wasn't a man. Auburn brown hair covered it, the ears pointed back like a shepherd's, and the head was a long canine shape with teeth that flashed when it breathed. The body was lean but tall, arms too long, hands hanging past mid-thigh. The claws weren't movie big, curved and sharp where they caught the moon. It balanced on the balls of its feet like it was ready. I didn't yell or bolt. I held still. It tipped its head up and stood there, chest out like it was under a warm shower, soaking in the moon. It didn't blink. When the wind pushed leaves, they banked around its shins like water hits a piling. Across the lake, a coyote yipped and got answered. Inside, my family whooped at something on TV and a bottle clinked on the counter. I thought about calling someone, but my phone was face down beside me and reaching for it felt dumb. I kept my hands where it could see them, palms open on my knees, like that meant anything. Then its ears perked. Both snapped toward the house. It turned in a slow, smooth motion to face me, and even that made the hair on my arms go weird. It lifted its head and sniffed, long and careful, like it was filtering the air. 3 breaths. On the third, the nostrils flared wider and stopped. It had me pinned. I didn't have a plan, except don't scream. I slid my heel back 1 inch so I wouldn't topple if my knees gave out. My heart pounded loud enough to count. I kept my mouth shut and my hands visible. "It's okay," I whispered, like an idiot. The sound rotated its ears, but it didn't lunge. It lowered its head and tilted, curious the way a dog listens. I caught its smell, a musky dog-on-old carpet scent mixed with cold lake air. Inside, Aunt Carol laughed too loud, and the creature flicked a glance at the window. If it went for the door and someone stepped out, that would be bad. It took 2 slow steps toward the porch. I thought about standing up, saw the claws, and ditched that idea. The back door was 5 feet to my left. Exactly. The lake lapped at the shore with little taps, and a fox barked once near the dock, then silence. It sniffed again, then exhaled a white plume that vanished in the cold. It wasn't panting. It was thinking. My family's volume bumped up. Someone yelled, "Turn it up!" And the thing flinched like the sound touched it. Then it looked straight at me, and the calm fell into the alertness I know from dogs deciding whether to chase. It tracked from my face to my hands and back. A tremor started in my right leg. I wasn't going to run. At all. It moved until it was at the bottom of the steps, 1 foot on the first plank like it was testing the wood. The porch creaked in a way I recognized. That familiarity helped me hold it together. I kept my eyes on its chest instead of teeth. It inhaled again, and I watched its shoulders lift. It knew where I was and how I was breathing. It lifted 1 hand, like I was a skittish animal. It extended a finger and brought it to the side of its muzzle, pressing the claw where a human mouth would be. Shh. It stood there with the claw to its muzzle for another beat. Then it dropped its hand like a person deciding not to argue, turned sideways, and walked toward the tall grass at the edge of our property. No rush, no show. It threaded through swing-set shadows, skirted the clothesline pole, and never looked back at me. At the seam where lawn turned to cattails, it moved different, lower, smoother, like it had practiced that route and knew which hummocks held. It slid into the reeds, parted them with an easy sway, and reached the tree line without a branch crack or leaf burst. Just gone. I stayed still and timed my breathing with the lake ticks on rock, thinking if I kept the rhythm quiet, nothing else would change. It slipped into the woods and didn't come out. That was it. It disappeared like it had somewhere else to be, and I was a problem it chose not to make. I stayed on the step because standing felt like I might kick a board and bring it back, and I wasn't going to be the reason it turned around. Inside, my family cheered at some dumb show. A cabinet door thumped, dice rattled in a cup, all of it regular noise. The phone by my thigh stayed face down. If I called anyone, voices would spill into the yard, and that felt like the exact opposite of what it had told me to do. So I listened hard for a misstep in the grass, and got nothing. I watched the gap in the fence and the black stripe of trees, and tried to work out how long it had been under us. How many nights we'd sat laughing while it sorted through metal and wood in the crawl space like a person checking drawers. My mouth was dry, but I kept it shut. Quiet felt like a rule, so I treated it as one. Now, before I get ahead of myself, the layout matters. The crawl space under the porch is boxed on 3 sides with cheap lattice, and one corner's been loose since Grandpa popped it off years back to run a drain. He never reattached it right, and we always said we would. The toolbox is a metal craftsman with a busted latch, sharp edges, and the coffee can of nails is heavy enough to sound off when it tips. That thing didn't wander in, it used the space. It dragged nails across brick in long, deliberate lines like it was thinking. It slid beams around and tested weight like it was planning exits. It came out through the loose corner we all knew about and never fixed because raccoons never pushed it far. It knew our soft points the way you learn a house by living with it. That bothered me more than the teeth. It meant time. It meant proximity while we were right there. Maryland is full of old talk that people dress up as jokes until winter hits and food's thin and the jokes don't land. I grew up hearing black dogs on back roads, white deer no one shoots, things in Patapsco that aren't deer, and we rolled our eyes because that's what you do. But the older ones had a word they used flat, not spooky. Wendigo. Not the movie monster. Their version was practical. People turned wrong by hunger and ugly decisions. People who kept going so long the going rewired them. They said those things remember doors and tools and schedules, 'cause remembering keeps you alive even when you're not rightly human anymore. They said sometimes they keep enough sense to weigh risk. I wasn't thinking magic. I was thinking a shape that used to be someone, stuck like that, still running cost-benefit in the dark. The shush made sense under that version. It wasn't for kindness. It was for control. 3 details locked it in. First, it had stayed under our porch long enough to pick through my grandfather's stuff, which meant it had been close while we were inside. Second, it didn't attack when it could have. It assessed me, tracked the room noise, and chose away. Third, it told me to be quiet like a neighbor would when your dog starts up after midnight. That's not animal. That's policy. It felt less like a threat and more like a boundary. Stay put, stay silent, and this stays clean. Maybe it was watching our rhythms, waiting for the right window to cross, or to check something it stashed under there, or to use the lake edge like a hallway that cut behind the houses. The warning read both ways. Don't call, don't spook the herd, let me pass. When the TV volume dipped, I eased the back door open, slipped inside, and slid the deadbolt because that was the only lever I had. My cousin said I looked weird, and I told him the air was cold. I told Grandpa the lattice was loose again, and he grunted he'd fix it tomorrow. I left the rest out. I never told my family what I saw that night, because they'd either call me crazy or get scared enough to move, and either way we'd lose a place we could actually afford and use, so I just carried it. After, I read what I could find that wasn't drawings and stories, county notes and old blotters and farm boards and even church bulletins. Throwaway lines about a tall animal with hands near reservoirs, trash cans tipped without prints, dogs going quiet at the tree line, and the pattern wasn't rare. Maryland has plenty if you look. People describe wolfish shapes that act like they understand houses and people, and sometimes the only thing that happens is a gesture, a head tilt, a hand up, shh, and then they pass. I moved states for work, and then again, but quiet autumn nights flipped the switch, and I'm back on that step with the lake ticking and my phone face down, thinking the scary part wasn't teeth, it was how it thought. Because something that's smart, that deliberate, can stand 10 feet from you and you won't know until it wants you to. And that's the part that sticks. The idea that the supernatural doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it just wants you to know it's there. My father used to tell this story when I was younger, especially during camping trips. He'd wait till the fire had burned down to coals and everyone had their hoodies up and the woods sounded bigger than they really are. Then he'd say he didn't want to scare us, which was his way of warning us he was about to anyway. Back in the 1970s, before I was born, he worked as a trail guide in California, leading tourists on horseback across mountain trails, mostly wide, dusty routes that roll through chaparral and oak, the kind of hills where you hear gravel ping off the horseshoes. He said he met this Native American guy who started as a regular customer and eventually became an employee. The man didn't say which reservation he'd come from, and Dad never pushed it. People leave for reasons, he'd tell me, and it's not my job to make him say it out loud. The guy was good with animals, calm seat, light hands, the sort of wrangler you put up front when a paying family thinks they know horses better than they do. Only thing Dad ever really noticed was that he didn't like questions about where he'd learned certain knots, and once, when a tourist offered him a Polaroid, he held it like it was warm from a pocket and said, "I'm fine," and gave it back without looking. Small stuff, but it sticks when you replay a day later. Anyway, one Saturday late spring, Dad, his brother, my uncle, and their native friend took a group of tourists up a ridge that looks down into a long bowl of grass and scrub. It was clear, a mean little breeze running the grass like a comb, and the group had those bulky cameras that hang heavy on your neck. Dad always talks about those straps, how people would forget and get off a horse with the strap wrapped around the horn. Someone in the back shouted "Coyote" and pointed into the valley. That was normal. In that part of Central California, you can hear them at night and sometimes see them loping around fence lines. So they halted, let the horses blow, heads turned the way a herd always does when one looks. People started standing in their stirrups to take pictures, the usual chorus of, "Do you see it? Where?" and hold on," and one kid asking if he could make a coyote noise. Dad told him no, 'cause the horses, not because of coyotes. Dad says my uncle kept staring and went, "That coyote sick or what?" Dad thought he meant mange or ticks, but my uncle pointed and said, "Look at the legs." It was standing, so the sun cut it flat. Long, thin legs, real bony looking, and the way it moved in that grass made Dad's neck itch, even telling it years later. Most dogs lift a front foot and the opposite back foot when they walk. This thing lifted both on one side like a camel, a weird side swing that looked wrong even at a distance. "Probably deformed," Dad said, and my uncle shrugged like, "Yeah, sure." The snout looked too long too, like someone had tugged it out an extra 3 inches, and it held the nose high, sniffing the air as if the ground smell wasn't the point. "Wind's wrong," Dad joked to a tourist so people wouldn't get nervous, but he said the joke died halfway out of his mouth because their friend had gone quiet. It wasn't just quiet. He'd gone still in the saddle, staring at the animal and not blinking much, the way horses stare at something that's deciding what it wants to be. Dad reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. It's something he did with green riders, just to ground them, and asked, "You good, man?" Their friend didn't look at him. He raised one hand, a little shake in it, and pointed. "Tail," he said, barely loud enough. Dad looked, expecting a burr-tangled rope of hair, and then realized the coyote had no tail at all. For a second, he tried to make that make sense. Some rancher's trap, a bad fight, congenital defect. But the longer he looked, the less it looked like a coyote missing a tail, and more like a thing built without the idea of one. Their friend swallowed, slid his eyes down to his horse's mane like he was counting braids, then up again. "We should go," he said, not frantic, just steady. "Now, before I explain what happened next, you need to understand how guides think. You don't spook tourists unless you have to, because spooked people yank reins and kick at the same time, and then you've got problems with 8 hooves and a slope." So Dad smiled and said, "All right, folks, we're moving on, nice and easy." And he put himself at the front while my uncle rode sweep. Their friend took a middle spot near a woman who wasn't great with her left leg cues. They started down the ridge at a slow jog trot, the kind that makes a camera slap a chest if you don't hold it. And every time a tourist tried to stop and look back, Dad clucked and kept the line moving. He said the tailless coyote followed the whole way, not climbing up to the trail, not closing the gap, just keeping pace in that valley, parallel with the switchbacks, sliding through the tall grass like a bad idea that refuses to be forgotten. One of the kids named it the Little Buddy, which made a couple people laugh, and someone asked if they could feed it a granola bar from the saddlebag, and Dad told them that was a no with both words and eyes. Their friend never looked over. If someone pointed, he pretended to be checking a cinch or fixed a stirrup length for a nervous rider. Now and then, when they hit a bend, Dad would see his jaw working like he was counting under his breath. They came around the last stand of scrub before the trail widened near the base camp, maybe 200 yards out, and you could see the truck roofs over the Palo Verdes. Dad was thinking about water troughs and getting people off clean. That's when the brush in front of them blew apart and the thing came out, 20 feet ahead, just there all at once like it had been sitting with the quail and decided it was time. Horses snorted and sat back hard. One of the tourists yelped and another one swore. Dad took a breath to say, "Hold them." But he didn't have to. Their friend's horse didn't move. It locked in place like it had nailed itself to the trail. The animal didn't look at the group. It looked at their friend. It stood square, legs wrong, head wrong. And then it did something Dad said he wishes he could take out of his head with a spoon. It smiled. Not that open-mouthed, tongue-out pant dogs do when they're hot. This was a full pullback of the lips, dry gums, all those yellow and brown teeth like someone had been painting them with coffee grounds. It held the smile and stared at him as if it had been waiting all day to make that exact shape with its face. A woman whispered, "Is it rabid?" And Dad said, "Eyes on me," even though his weren't. Their friend stared back, and his hands were steady now. He reached into his shirt, not fumbling, not rushing, and pulled out a small piece of wood strung on a short leather thong. Dad said it looked like a thumb-length tag, smooth from being handled, with a simple arrow burned into one side. No speech, no show. He just lifted it in front of his chest the way you hold up a badge when you want someone to see it. He didn't wave it or shout or anything like that. He just showed it to the coyote, which immediately looked away from the protective charm. Then the creature howled, but coyote howls are usually high-pitched, while this one was very low, almost baritone. It sounded like the thing had fluid in its lungs, like it was drowning and couldn't make one final scream. After that haunting sound, it ran back into the bushes and disappeared. My uncle, ever the jokester, turned to the stunned tourists and said he hoped they got their money's worth. Nobody answered. They moved. Dad ordered single file and kept his voice level, and the horses listened because he did. Their friend never glanced at the brush again. He stared at his horse's ears and rode hands light, like he was trying to make the saddle quiet. At the camp clearing, they dismounted in a practiced rush. My uncle tied reins and blocked a skittish mare with his hip. Dad pointed the group to the coolers and said the bathrooms were open. He told them pictures would be mailed. He kept everything sounding normal. A couple tourists tried to ask about rabies. One asked if they should call Fish and Game. Dad said they could leave their names at the office and he'd follow up, which was his way of slowing everything down. Their friend went straight to the tack room and sat on a wool blanket like his legs didn't want to work anymore. He didn't shake. He just put his hands palm down and waited with his mouth set tight. When the last car left and the dust settled on the lot, he finally spoke. He wouldn't give them the whole story, only vague statements like, "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me." Dad asked, "Who's them?" And he said, "People I knew, not here." My uncle said, "So what are we even talking about?" Their friend kept looking at the door. "I'm protecting you," he said, "because the less you know about it, the better." He said the word at the way you'd say a person's name if you didn't want to give them the respect. Dad didn't press for names or places. He said, "Okay, what keeps it off us?" Their friend pulled a little cloth pouch from his shirt and tipped out 3 small pieces of wood, each with a simple arrow burned into one face. He handed one to Dad and one to my uncle and kept one. "On you," he said. "Always on you." He told them if they heard that sound again, they should not answer, not whistle, not even look toward it. He said it would try to draw them out with voices that sounded familiar. This was clearly a Wendigo situation. Dad uses that word now when he tells it, because the pattern fits. But back then, he only knew it as something his friend understood and feared for good reasons. Something that had once been human, twisted by hunger and dark practices, wearing an animal wrong. Dad asked if a gun would help. Their friend shook his head. "Not if you don't hit the right place," he said. "This works." He tapped the little arrow. He told them to burn any leftover food and bleach the trash barrels, and to keep the dogs inside that night. They did it. Dad poured out the saddlebag crumbs in a metal drum and lit them. My uncle hauled a 5-gallon jug and sloshed bleach into the bins until the air bit their throats. Their friend walked the fence alone with a flashlight he didn't switch on. When he came back, he looked like someone who'd checked the numbers on a lock 3 times. He said, "It's not right on us." He didn't say safe. He asked for a Coke, took 2 swallows, and put the can down without finishing it. He said he was glad he got to test the protective charms and see that they worked against the creature. "It looked away," he said, "so it knows it can't cross that." He made them repeat back the rules. Charm on, don't answer, no leftovers. He checked their arrows for scorch depth like he cared about the workmanship. He looked at the office clock, 8 p.m., and said, "I have to go." He hugged Dad, shook my uncle's hand, and told them to keep the dogs in for a week. Then he drove away in a rattling pickup. Dad never saw him again. No call, no letter, nothing, which Dad says made sense. If you bring trouble with you, you keep moving until it stops knowing your name. For a while, they closed the ridge trail and ran beginner loops near the road. They didn't say why. At night, with the wind coming down canyon, Dad swore he heard that same low, wet howl hang under the power lines and fade. And every time he reached for the little arrow without thinking. The charm sat by the back door like a house key. The piece of wood with the arrow burned into it stayed in our family for years as protection, wrapped in a shop towel in a kitchen drawer. We moved houses twice and it came with us both times. When Dad told the story, he'd tap that drawer and keep going. I've researched Wendigo stories since hearing Dad's tale, and the description matches. Deformed animals that move wrong and act like they're thinking. The long, thin legs, the camel gait, the too long snout held high, the missing tail, the way it paralleled the group without closing. It all lines up with something imitating life instead of being it. The fact that it smiled and followed them suggests it was studying the group, learning their behavior. Wendigos are supposed to be former humans who resorted to cannibalism and got cursed, becoming these hunting creatures. The tailless coyote was probably just the form it chose to use while stalking potential prey in broad daylight. Growing up, my grandma was what Navajo people call a crystal gazer and hand trembler, practicing native medicine and ceremonies. People would come from all over the reservation, asking for healings or protection from evil entities that plagued their families. She taught my aunt and cousin these ancient rituals like an apprenticeship, passing down knowledge kept quiet for generations. My cousin told me the scariest stories about the things they dealt with, to explain the rules we lived by and why they mattered. One story was about a persistent skinwalker that was attacking neighbors of my grandparents on the reservation. This wasn't just any evil spirit. It was a Wendigo-like creature that had once been human, but had turned to dark practices. Night after night it went to their homestead, tapping on windows, opening the horse corral, knocking over water bottles. It was said a jealous man sent it because a girl there refused to date him. At first it felt like pranks. The gate unlatched, the porch bulb popping, small piles of salt kicked over by the door. Their dog lay under the truck facing away from the north wall and would not move, and that was when the mother stopped laughing. Footprints showed up that weren't quite right, too long and too light, and the father found a bitten bottle he couldn't place. They tried not to ask for help because nobody likes admitting they're scared, but they were sleeping in shifts by the end of the week. Now, before I explain what happened next, you need to understand Grandma didn't chase this kind of thing unless she had to. The family visited my grandparents asking for help, but Grandma was reluctant to get involved with skinwalker business. She listened, trembled her hand over the basket, and told them to strengthen their home first. Clean corners, cedar smoke, no careless words. For 2 days it went quiet. Then the creature came back and focused on their sheep herder, who lived alone in a small house by the corral. It called his name in voices he knew, his sister, a nephew, even the boss who'd left town. Soft and patient, almost friendly. One night he ran to the main house shaking, saying, "It's outside saying my name." The father told him to calm down and walked him back, checking the yard, the shed, the crawl space, and found nothing. He figured the man was spooked by night sounds and coyote calls and told him to sleep, door locked, lights off. But this creature was more dangerous than anyone realized, and it was just getting started. The next morning, the sheep herder didn't come over for breakfast like he always did. The father went to check and found the front door wide open. He called out and heard only the radio hissing on a dead station. He started searching, and it wasn't long before he made a horrifying discovery. The man had been strangled with barbed wire from the sheep corral, and their entire flock was gone. The wire had been pulled off the fence and twisted into a hard knot. The hoof prints ran to hardpan and vanished. He backed away and yelled for his brother, called for help, then drove straight to my grandparents' place. The family was devastated and terrified, and they asked again for help because now they knew it could kill. Grandma didn't waste time. She told my aunt to bring cedar and ash and had my cousin gather the stones and pollen. My cousin told me about the ceremony they performed to get rid of the skinwalker once and for all. I won't give steps, but timing mattered and names mattered, and they set what needed to be set at the door and along the cut fence. The father wanted to board up the sheep herder's house, and Grandma told him to leave it alone until she said otherwise. A cousin called from the wash saying he'd found a few sheep tangled in brush, some alive and some not, tongues torn. "Put the hurt ones down and come back," Grandma said. "Don't leave pain walking around the hills. It draws things." The men came back pale and quiet, and stood by the truck while my aunt tended a small coal fire in a metal lid. They heard a scrape on the far wall and then nothing, like it realized the threshold wasn't the same anymore. The dog under the truck moaned once and went still. The air felt heavy, like before a storm. The father stared at the empty chair where the sheepherder used to sit and asked, "What is it?" Grandma knew this was a Wendigo situation, something that had consumed human flesh and become twisted into pure hunger and malice. Before sunrise, we were back at the neighbor's place, and Grandma told everyone to keep voices low and not step across the ash lines my aunt laid out. My cousin set the ceremonial basket by the east-facing door because that's where Grandma pointed, and I kept my hands behind my back so I wouldn't brush anything. The ingredients were specific, and I'm not listing them. They crackled when she pinched them, and the crystal arrowhead lay on a cloth until Grandma nodded. She placed it in the center, covered it, and smoothed the top once with the back of her fingers. She told the father to cut the generator, silence the phones, and not speak unless she asked. And he agreed, because he knew now what ignoring rules could cost. When Grandma started, it wasn't dramatic, just steady, like counting, and my aunt backed her on the low parts. My cousin held the basket with both hands and kept it level, elbows tucked, and I watched the door because Grandma told me to speak if anything stepped into the yard. "If anything hits the wall, don't look," she said. The radio clicked to static and died. From the back room came a single tap, then another, small as knuckles on wood. The air changed, like a heater kicked on even though there wasn't one, and the basket began to hum, more pressure than sound you feel in your teeth. The ingredients shifted against each other though no one moved. My cousin whispered she couldn't hold it much longer, and Grandma told her to breathe with the song, keep the rim straight. Outside, one short bleat cut across the yard even though the flock was gone. The dog made a low sound, and then went quiet. The arrowhead rose. It pushed up through the ingredients like something surfacing and turned flat in the air above the basket, hovering a foot up, turning slow, a tool waiting to be used. Grandma didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on the basket and tightened the song, and my aunt followed, and the sound pulled tight like a rope. From the back room came a scrape, like furniture moving though we had cleared it the night before. The doorway stayed empty. It climbed higher, past my cousin's chin, and then it snapped like someone letting go of a bent branch. The arrowhead shot across the room so fast it blurred, straight through the doorway into the cold air and across the yard like it had been fired from an invisible bow. We all flinched except Grandma. The impact sounded far off, not metal, a solid thud you feel in your feet. The tapping stopped mid-scratch. Grandma said, "Keep going," and we did. No talking, no looking around, just song and breath. We kept it up until the sun came over the ridge and laid a bright strip across the floor. Grandma brought the song down step by step and closed it, then told my cousin to set the basket down. Nobody moved at first. The father asked, low, "Where did it go?" My cousin stared at the door like she expected it to fly back in, but nothing moved. Grandma wiped her hands and said, "It took care of it." Same tone she used for ordinary things. The men walked the yard once at her request and came back without a word. They fed us and thanked us, and we went home in twos, nobody alone. Grandma told us not to talk about it outside the family yet. I watched our yard from the kitchen table because sometimes things try twice, but the day stayed quiet. Near noon, the father called to say a coyote carcass lay past the wash, stiff and drawn thin like it had starved in a night, and Grandma said, "Leave it," and hung up. That was the end of the ceremony itself, and nobody wanted to test it by asking for more signs. The family was freed from the skinwalker's curse and didn't have to worry about it again after that morning. That's how my cousin told it. She said the crystal arrowhead had found and destroyed the thing wherever it was hiding. And I didn't argue because the house felt different and people stopped jumping at every noise. This kind of Wendigo skinwalker feeds on fear and flesh. It wears people down and then takes what it wants. But the old ceremonies still have reach over things that think they can't be touched. The Navajo have been fighting creatures like this for longer than I can count, with songs and rules and tools passed down because somebody needed them and somebody listened. What made this one different was how the arrowhead went out to hunt on its own. Grandma said that's how you know it worked, when the helpers don't wait for you to send them twice, and the house goes quiet on its own. I asked if the jealous man would pay for what he started, and she said people bring holes into their own houses when they go looking for this, and the hole doesn't stay where they put it. We didn't go back that week. That crystal arrowhead ceremony still gets used today when families are plagued. On the reservation. About 3 years ago, I had just gotten out of my boyfriend's car outside my house around 11 p.m. I walked around the front of the car to kiss him goodbye like I always did. Quick peck, see you tomorrow, that kind of thing. And 2 houses down there was a street light, and from the corner of my eye I caught sight of a black figure. When I'd initially walked around the car, there was nothing there. The sidewalk was empty. But in the few seconds it took me to say goodbye, this thing had appeared. Like it had stepped out of a blind spot I didn't know existed. It was standing right under the streetlight, about 6 to 7 feet tall and completely solid black, no shine, no edges I could trust. I was already moving back toward my gate without meaning to, and I asked my boyfriend if he saw the deer too, hoping that's all it was. I said it like a joke, but my voice cracked. He didn't joke back. He looked where I was pointing and said, low and careful, that it definitely wasn't a deer and that we should slowly back away toward my house. So we did the slow shuffle, keys ready in my hand, and neither of us stopped looking at it because we were both scared it would move if we took our eyes off it. Now, before I explain what happened next, you need to understand my street layout. Driveway straight to a short path. Porch light that dies if you don't jiggle the switch, chain link fence to the right, hedges to the left, and that street light that always flickered around midnight. The thing was framed by that flicker, and it didn't belong to anything I knew. I whispered that it might be some guy in a costume 'cause Halloween and July vibes happen around here sometimes. Long story. But my boyfriend just shook his head once and said, "Door. Now." I didn't run. I didn't turn my back either. I felt stupid for worrying about how it would look, but I kept my shoulders square and backed up one step at a time because turning felt like asking for it. What I was staring at had the body of a wolf, tall but not overly wide, with what looked like antlers on its head. It was such a dark shade of black that even under the streetlight you couldn't see details. Just a solid outline like a cutout someone pasted onto the night. The thing didn't move much at first, but when I initially spotted it, its head was down and turned away from me, like it was sniffing or listening to something low. As I started backing toward my house, it slowly turned its head to face me directly. I couldn't see a muzzle move or hair shift or anything that would tell me wind was hitting it. It just rotated and locked on. Its eyes were a deep blood red color that seemed to glow in the darkness. Not bright like LEDs, more like something burning behind glass. I was absolutely terrified, but I made the mistake of staring directly into those eyes. Do not do that. Ever. It was almost like falling into a trance. I couldn't move away or walk any further because I was completely petrified, legs heavy like I'd just sunk ankle deep in concrete. My boyfriend touched my elbow and said my name. Once, twice, a third time sharper, and I couldn't answer. The creature just held its gaze on me, not moving or turning its head, and the street got too quiet, like even the bugs had backed off. For a long second I thought if I blinked, it would sprint. I heard a car far off. I heard our porch light buzz. But all of that was background to those eyes. My boyfriend kept his voice low, telling me to breathe, telling me, left 2 steps. And I tried, I did. But I only managed a half step, and then my knee kind of locked. I don't cry easily, but I had this stupid sting in my eyes, and that just made the red sharper, like the color had edged closer. The thing's antlers, or whatever they were, shifted the tiniest bit. I swear it wasn't wind. And then it lowered its head, not like a bow, more like it was lining something up. My dad opened the front door to ask what was happening. Full voice, no filter. "Why are you two still out there?" And that's when the thing finally moved. It turned, fast, like it was hinged, and ran off into the woods behind the house 2 doors down from us. The way it ran was wrong. Very fast and swaying like a big cat, not bouncing like a wolf or deer would. It cleared the curb in one glide and cut between a trash can and a mailbox without touching either, and it moved with this fluid, predatory grace that was definitely not natural for any normal animal around here. My boyfriend said, "Inside." And I didn't argue. I bolted the last steps and hit the deadbolt as soon as the door closed. I went inside and asked my dad to check our security cameras since we had them pointing in all directions except the backyard. We'd never seen anything back there but raccoons and the neighbor's kid cutting through. He flipped on the monitor in the hallway, and my boyfriend stood behind us, hands on the back of a dining chair like he needed to hold something. Dad grumbled about the porch light sensor again, and I just said, "Please. The street. 2 houses down. Timestamp 11:01. He scrubbed back 20 seconds, then 30, and there we were. Me and my boyfriend by the car, the streetlight flickering just like always. We watched the feed frame by frame. Nothing. Nothing. Then a glitch line. Then this tall shape just appeared at the edge of the streetlight circle. No walking into frame. No gradual approach. It was like the camera caught it mid-step, even though it hadn't shown the step before. Dad frowned and said the system sometimes drops frames. He hates that it does that. And he rolled it back again so we could try to catch the approach. Same thing. Empty sidewalk, artifact flicker, then the shape, tall and big, exactly where I'd seen it. Dad loosened the pause and let it play in real time. The figure didn't register as a person. The night vision usually turns people into pale gray cutouts with faces blown out white, even if they're in a hoodie. But on the feed, the thing was just this moving slab of black, like it was cut out of the video itself. I said, "Watch the head," and right then it turned toward us in the feed, slow motion creepy because of the frame rate, and even on the monitor I could feel that locked-on feeling coming back, which is stupid, but that's how it felt. Then the front door opened in the footage, Dad stepping out, and the thing pivoted and ran the exact path we'd seen, through the same gap, into the trees. Dad rewound to show the street again, then jumped to the side camera facing the corner by the neighbor's hedge. We saw the top edge of it glide past the bottom of the frame, fast and low, like it knew where the camera cones were. Dad muttered that he'd never seen a dog or coyote move like that, and he started checking the driveway camera next, then the far corner by the utility pole. When we reviewed the footage, we saw a dark shadow of something tall and big moving in the same direction I'd seen the figure. What was weird was that our cameras had night vision and usually showed cats and dogs as white shapes. But this huge shadow moving across the frame appeared completely black, like it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. My dad deleted the video that same night, just walked back to the hallway monitor and started clearing clips like he was taking out the trash, and I grabbed his wrist and said, "Don't, we need that." But he shook me off and said he wasn't going to let some glitchy camera app scare the house. He's practical to a fault. He said, "You saw a dog in bad lighting, and compression makes blobs look weird," and he clicked yes on every little prompt. When I raised my voice, he said, "I live here too," and he hit delete and folded his arms like it was settled. I tried again in the kitchen, calmer, told him I just wanted a copy on a thumb drive so I could think straight, and he wiped his hands on a towel and said, "No. You'll post it somewhere and some idiot will come snooping." He wasn't wrong about the idiots, but that wasn't the point. He added that he'd already texted the neighbor about raccoons tipping bins, and that was the only story he was comfortable with. So that was that. He turned off the monitor and said, "Bed," like I was 12. A week later, I brought it up again and he said, "We are not doing this," and changed the subject to the porch light sensor, which he actually fixed that weekend with a new bulb and tape over the housing because it kept facing the street. After that, we didn't mention it out loud, but I kept replaying how it turned its head and how my legs stopped, and I kept thinking about the part where it just appeared. Months later, different boyfriend, we'd broken up over other stuff, and I told him the whole thing over takeout. He said, "You mean like a Wendigo?" And I laughed because it sounded like campfire talk, and he pulled up posts and threads and short videos and explained what they were supposed to be. Until he said that word, I never had a name for it, but the description fit too well. A tall, dark creature with predatory movements and eyes that could paralyze you with fear. He said Wendigos were former humans who resorted to cannibalism and got cursed, became these hungry hunting things. I said, "Why here?" And he said they're drawn to people. He said they go where the prey is, even cul-de-sacs and parking lots, and the way it showed up under the streetlight sounded deliberate, like it had been watching. Those red eyes weren't just animal eyes. There was intelligence there, like it understood exactly what it was doing. He asked if I looked right into them and I said yes, stupidly. And he said, "Don't do that. It sets a hook. Like fishing." I wanted to roll my eyes at the word hook, 'cause it sounded dramatic, but it felt right. I told him about the trance. I told him how I couldn't move away and how my knee locked and how my boyfriend had to keep saying my name, and he said that's how they pick. They freeze you first. He said it isn't magic so much as predator stuff, you know? Stare down, timing, getting you to cooperate with your own fear. He said the sudden appearance made sense too, that they know blind spots and cameras and angles because they watch people a long time. Hearing it described like that didn't help. It just made it all feel more planned. It's been over 2 years since that night, but my dad still won't talk about it. He saw the footage and knew it wasn't normal. You could tell by the way he stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw set. But his worldview can't accept what we both witnessed, so he keeps it buried under jokes about firmware updates and raccoons. I think about it a lot, especially when I'm outside at night by my door. Keys already between my fingers, shoulder to the wood, counting the deadbolt turns. I keep my head on a swivel. The locals don't talk about Wendigos, not here. But there have been other sightings. Quiet ones. Nothing viral. People say they saw a tall dark figure at the tree line or a shape crossing the sidewalk that moved wrong. The clips on the community page show shadows sliding against fences, not running, just gliding like the ground's on rails for them. It's mostly comments about coyotes and teenagers. Every so often someone says, "red eyes," and gets laughed off. I screen record those posts anyway and back them up in a folder. The thing that won't leave me alone is how it knew exactly when to appear and where to stand. Like it studied my routine. Late night drop-offs, quick goodbye at the curb, porch light that flickers, dad who doesn't usually open the door unless he hears the lock. It picked the street light 2 houses down so I'd have to look past my car and past my boyfriend and give it that full second with my eyes. That's planning. That's not an accident. It wasn't hungry enough to risk the porch. It wanted me to see it first. Even now, I don't linger outside after dark. If I'm getting out of a car, I scan the streetlights first, then the hedges, then the gap by the mailbox where it slid through. I don't wear headphones to bring the trash out. I don't glance at my phone on the driveway. I don't turn my back on the woods without putting something solid at my side. I keep the porch light sensor aimed at the steps, and I test it once a week. And I never, ever meet eyes with anything standing under a light. Because once a Wendigo has seen you, really locked eyes with you, it never forgets your scent or your face. About 5 years ago, I was visiting my cousin's house for a weekend stay. I have 4 cousins, twin girls aged 10 and 2 older brothers aged 21 and 26, and that night I slept in the spare room with the 21-year-old because the couch was taken. We were half asleep when stuff started falling in the girls' room next to us. A small clink, then a thud, then a clatter that sounded like a snow globe rolling and dropping. We figured the twins were goofing off. They always were. But then one of them called to her sister from way across the room. That killed the pillow fight idea. My cousin said, "Stay," and still stepped out. I followed because I wasn't letting him walk in alone. He pushed their door open, and I watched over his shoulder. The girls stood by their beds, hands up like they'd been caught doing something, and talked over each other, saying things were falling off the shelves by themselves. Hair clips, the snow globe, a stack of paperbacks. The lamp on the dresser was tilted like it had been shoved. My cousin checked the window latch and the vent, tapped the bracket like maybe it was loose, and I was about to say truck vibrations when one twin said, "It's the closet." Right then, the closet door burst open with tremendous force. It didn't just swing, it blew past the stop and slammed the wall so hard the top hinge snapped. Something humanoid but completely wrong came out, longer than any person, too thin, with elbows and knees that moved like extra joints. It ran on all fours, palms and the tops of its long feet smacking the rug, and crossed the room in a blink. The twins screamed. My cousin reached for them and missed because the thing was already in the hall. We jumped back. He yelled, "Hey!" and it didn't even glance. It shot through the living room, clipped a folding chair, and headed straight for the front door like it knew the house. The hit sounded like a bat through old wood. The deadbolt tore out of the jamb, the hinges blew, and the door bowed, then ripped free. The screen door tore like paper, and it was gone into the night. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds. We stood there with the cold air coming in, door on the lawn, splinters everywhere, and nobody saying anything. The older brother ran in barefoot, saw the mess, and just stared. We didn't chase it. He put the girls behind the kitchen island and told me to call 911. I expected the dispatcher to ask me to repeat myself, but she was all business. Any injuries, stay inside, don't go out. The 26-year-old killed the AC, so the return wouldn't pull air from the open doorway. By the time he grabbed duct tape to hang plastic, cruisers rolled up with lights on and no sirens. 2 officers went straight to the yard. One did a quick sweep, another stayed with us. An SUV with a K9 arrived and the dog started barking before its door opened. You could see the officers clocking how real it was the second they stepped into the entry and saw a door lying in the grass. They split up and started talking on the radio like they'd done this 1,000 times. We told them exactly what we saw because adding anything would make it sound fake. They pushed a search out within about 5 miles. From the window I watched flashlights pass along the hedges and the sidewalk toward the storm drain, and then out toward the little stand of trees by the corner. One officer checked the side gate with my older cousin. No prints, no scuffs, no drag. The K9 hit on something at the top step and lost it at the curb. A second unit arrived and went slow down the block, spotlighting under cars, up into the maple canopy, even the gutters, which felt ridiculous until I remembered the way that thing moved. Another officer walked the back fence line with a second dog. They paused at a gap by the trash cans, then shook their heads and kept going. Neighbors cracked doors and peered out, got told to go back inside, The radio kept spitting little bursts of numbers and short phrases I didn't understand. And every so often someone would ask if we heard anything else from inside, any movement, any noises in the attic. And we'd say no because the only sound in the house was the fridge humming. They asked about pranks, big dogs, any wildlife issues. Coyotes? One said, but his partner was already shaking his head. Not for this, he muttered, pointing with his chin at the broken hardware like it was doing the talking. The K9 handler asked if anyone in the house had been bleeding recently, and the twins both said no in the exact same pitch. Nobody had anything useful. It was like it launched from our house and disappeared. One place did have sign. The front door. The jamb was split into ragged spears, and some of them had small dark smears where something had raked across. There were dots on the weather strip and a couple dime-sized spots on the top step. The sergeant popped his tailgate and came back with evidence packets. He put on fresh gloves, snapped photos with a scale card, labeled the frame with a marker, and told an officer to hold a light steady. He took a moment to pick out which splinters were still anchored enough not to fall when he touched them, then swabbed the first smear and capped it. He tweezed a jag of wood loose and folded it into a paper bindle, wrote a case number across the flap, and handed it off. Another officer used forceps to lift a fleck from the step into a vial. The K9 handler stood by writing times and locations on a clipboard and called them out as each envelope changed hands. The older brother asked if they wanted the door moved off the lawn yet, and the sergeant said, "Not until we finish the steps," without looking up. The search teams checked in again. Negative in the park, negative along the drainage channel, negative behind the strip mall, and the sergeant kept working the frame piece by piece. Someone asked if we had bleach. "Not yet," the sergeant said, and explained they wanted the samples clean before anyone tried to board the opening. Then he told us they'd run tests to try and identify what kind of animal we'd encountered. 3 days later, the sergeant called my older cousin and asked for speaker, so we set phone on the kitchen counter. He said lab rushed the swabs, and short version was inconclusive, not clerical, not contamination. Chain of custody was solid, issue was profile. Markers sat near human, but not like primates. Software kept forcing a human match and then rejecting it. It wasn't human, but it wouldn't land on any animal in their database, and biologists used words like altered and mosaic. My 21-year-old cousin asked if it could be synthetic. "We asked that," the sergeant said. "No CRISPR pattern, no vector, no edit signature." I asked if that meant it used to be a person. He wouldn't agree and wouldn't disagree. The blood matched the time of night and carried hemoglobin like ours, but the mitochondrial piece branched off in a way that didn't land on any tree. He said he'd loop a wildlife liaison and the state biologist so it wouldn't die in prank territory, and repeated that calling immediately kept our statements clean. The older brother said, "You don't talk about this at school," and twins nodded. Now, before I explain what I was thinking, you need to understand I grew up on winter stories, and the word for someone who turns hungry stuck with me. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying those stories say it keeps pieces and loses pieces, and what it keeps makes you open a door when you shouldn't. So I told them what I remembered, that it moves like it learned to run wrong after it changed, that it knows houses because it used to live in one. The 26-year-old said, "We're not feeding it fear," and he ordered a steel core door and a long screw kit because sleeping behind a tarp isn't a plan. We added a camera in the hall and another on the porch. 2 days later, the sergeant dropped by with a redacted copy of the lab notes. He tapped the new strike plate and said, "Better," then asked again about unfamiliar vehicles or anyone watching. We said no. He left his card and said sometimes the answer shows up months later tied to an unrelated case, and left. To this day, they still live there. No more incidents. No animal on neighborhood cams, no strange prints after rain, no prowler calls that match. We never figured out how it got into the closet. Windows still had factory tabs, back slider bar was in the track, and the garage entry showed undisturbed paint on the hinge screws. If it picked a lock, it left nothing, and if it came from the attic, there was no disturbed patch and no soffit out of line. The answer everyone hates is the one that fits. It was already in there. It picked a space kids reach into without thinking, and parents don't check once it looks neat. I did research anyway. I found a few posts about long shapes in houses, something under a dining table, a figure folding into a laundry room and sliding away when the light came on. Some were obvious fakes. Some felt like hours in the boring parts. Response times, officer questions, the way a door fails when it's hit from the inside out. None of them had a clean ending. The ones that stopped were the ones where the thing left fast and nobody chased it. That matched us. We didn't move. The twins slept with the hall light on for a week and then turned it off. The older brother taught them to slam a door to jam the latch, showed them the heavy flashlight, and drilled who dials first and who opens the back gate. Months passed and nothing happened. That quiet isn't proof of anything. It's just quiet. Sometimes at dinner, the 21-year-old would glance toward the hall and then keep eating. I still replay the 10 seconds, the straight line to the door like it had mapped exits and picked the cheapest failure point, and I think we were lucky it only wanted out, because if it wanted the girls, it had them, and luck is not a plan. I used to live in northern Arizona, and I'm 1/4 Navajo. My grandfather was pure blood and taught me to recognize dangerous things. Every summer we stayed at my uncle's 3-story house where the basement was the living room. For some reason they always left these huge windows open at night, big enough for anyone to climb through. I'd seen skinwalkers snooping around that property more than once. Distant silhouettes where no one should be, and coyotes standing too tall and moving wrong. I knew exactly what to expect when you leave a window big enough for a person to climb through. That situation made me uncomfortable because of a family story from when we were babies. We stayed in my aunt's trailer, and they woke up in the dark to find all the locks on the floor, doors wide open, and my brother missing a lock of hair. My aunt did a ritual to save him, and it worked. He grew up fine, and he's chasing his dreams now. Moral was simple. Don't invite bad things inside. Now, the basement. 2 couches faced those windows. Behind Grandma's couch, we kept a thin mattress we'd pull out. The carpet had a seam by the stairs where the kitchen light made a rectangle. The laundry nook opened to the hall. If something came through the windows, you'd hear a rattle. If something came down the stairs, you'd see shadow first. That's all you need to picture. That night we got ready for bed down there. Grandma on one couch, my brother and his friend on the other, me and my aunt on the mattress behind Grandma's. Everyone else went camping outside to hunt skinwalkers, which seemed insane to me. My aunt stole my pillow at lights out and said I'd live. It went quiet fast. Around 1 a.m. I woke up and sat up. Everything looked normal. The windows were black. Out past the hill, I saw distant flashlights, the skinwalker hunters doing their thing. I lay back down, still uneasy for no clean reason, just that nerves on edge feeling that doesn't explain itself. The open windows didn't help. At 4 a.m., I rolled onto my left side and saw my aunt on the floor next to me. She must have rolled off our mattress and wrapped herself up, because there was this bundle, long hair spread across the carpet like a fan. She was cocooned tight except for a knee and a bit of shoulder, breathing slow and steady. I remember thinking, fine, keep the pillow. Then it clicked. My aunt had been sleeping on the right side of the mattress. She'd tucked her braid over her shoulder and joked about stealing more blanket from me because I run hot. I wasn't on the left because I liked it. I was there because she'd taken the right. So why was she on my left? On the floor, hair down and long. My aunt keeps her hair just below the shoulders. The hair on the carpet next to me could have brushed my knuckles. I didn't move my head. I slid my eyes right. On the right side of the mattress, behind me, my aunt's shape was there. Braid tied short, breath a faint hiss. 2 bodies. One was my aunt. One was not. My tongue stuck to my teeth. I counted with my eyes. Grandma, my brother, his friend, aunt, me, and then that bundle. The numbers didn't work unless the bundle was the problem. I kept my face slack and my breathing boring. My grandfather's voice in my head. Don't blink. Don't stare. Don't show your throat. The window screen sat still and open. The stair rectangle stayed dark. Whatever was wrapped beside me had either come through the glass without a rattle or walked down those stairs without a sound. It had moved up to our mattress and settled like it belonged. It knew our sleeping. I looked again at the knee. The joint wasn't right. It bent too long. The skin, whatever it was, had a fold in the wrong direction. The proportions made my eyes try to blame blankets, but the carpet pile didn't lie. Weight pressed where it shouldn't. There was a dry smell under the detergent, like old fur and sun-baked dust. I thought about the locks on the floor, and my brother's hair gone, and my aunt whispering prayers with ash water in a bowl. I swallowed so it wouldn't click. I thought about nudging my aunt. Bad idea. If she startled, she'd shout. I thought about Grandma. Worse. If you make more noise than the thing, you lose. If you move smart, you get a second. That's all you ever get. I set a plan in 4 steps. Hand under the mattress for leverage, shift to the carpet seam so it wouldn't squeak, roll toward the stairs, pull the chain on the bare bulb, get everyone moving. The bundle twitched. The long hair lifted like something underneath turned its head. The knee unbent and rebent, slow and creaky, like it didn't use knees unless it had to. Cold up my back, heat into my legs. My grandfather said when you get scared or hurt, you either freeze or you flood. I flooded. My heart slammed hollow, but the plan stayed. I was flooded with adrenaline and knew I had to move fast before this thing realized I was awake. I reached up and grabbed the couch, flipped myself over to the other side, and the frame thumped hard enough to wake my grandma. I felt her hand brush my ankle, startled, and I whispered, "Stay awake. Stay quiet." And I kept my eyes over the cushion seam because the bundle on the floor was stretching now, like cloth filling with water. We both watched as it unrolled without using its hands the way a person would. It just unwound and slid, and I could hear my breath stutter, so I clamped my mouth shut. The thing found the edge of the couch and slithered along it, not bumping anything, not catching on the lamp cord, just gliding. And the movement was wrong in a way I only knew from games, like the Heartless in Kingdom Hearts, that kind of fluid shadow drift that ignores bones. Grandma's head barely moved, but I heard her start murmuring, the old prayers taught to settle the air and name what doesn't belong here. Low and steady Navajo words that always made the hair on my neck lie flat. It rounded the couch. The hair trailed behind it like it was floating, and when it reached the window it raised up a little, not standing, more like pushing itself on a hinge from somewhere in the middle. It paused and went still, and I swear it looked back over the couch at us with a face I couldn't focus on. Not because it blurred, but because it used my aunt's blanket as if that was a face too. Like it wanted me to think it was still her, and my stomach folded in on itself. Grandma's whisper didn't stop. The words tightened. It dipped toward the screen, and with a push that made no sound at all, it slid outside, and was gone. We stayed frozen long enough to map every breath in the room. My brother snored once and rolled onto his side. My aunt shifted behind the mattress and said something in her sleep. I didn't answer because I didn't want to draw anything back. Grandma tapped the couch twice, our signal for don't move, and then once, okay. I got to my knees and checked the window. The screen was still in place, but the corner had a bend like a thumb had pressed it and then let go. The desert air sat heavy and cool and empty. I locked the latch, then the backup stick my uncle cut for summer. Then I shoved the little table against the frame. It was nothing, but nothing was better than inviting. Grandma pulled me close to her face and said, very soft, "It knows us." I said, "It copied her hair." She nodded. "It watched." I said, "Wendigo or skinwalker?" She made a face like, "Don't make me say it." "It learned," she said instead. "It will try again if doors are mouths." We lay back down without lying down, if that makes sense. Bodies pretending to rest so we didn't set off anyone else. She kept the prayer going, quieter, like a hum in the back of the throat. I stared at the rectangle of the stair light and waited for it to fill, but it never did. When the first gray line showed at the window, she squeezed my wrist once. That meant we made it through the night. After it left, Grandma explained it plain, not a ghost story, just information I needed if I was going to keep my head. She said these things, the ones that wear you like a coat, they infiltrate families by shape-shifting and studying patterns. Who sleeps where, who gets up for water, who locks, who forgets, and they try on pieces until someone lets them in without realizing. Wendigos are good at voices and movements, she said, and some skinwalkers are too, but they never get all of it right. The knee I saw was the mistake. The way it wrapped the blanket like it didn't need shoulders was the mistake. They hide their mistakes by hurrying, she said, or by making you feel silly for looking. She looked toward the window. We helped it by leaving mouths open. She believed it had been coming for weeks, steps at a time. First the yard, then the porch, then the screen pushed and put back, then the inside for just a minute to smell our soap and see who sleeps with a phone under the pillow. "That's why your dog wouldn't go down last time," she added, and I thought back to our cousin's mutt blanking at the top step, staring into the dark and whining until he hid under the kitchen table. The pattern fit too well, and wanting it to be random didn't change the math. When the sun finally got high enough, Grandma set a bowl on the floor, cornmeal and ash and cedar needles, and she did the cleanse the way she was taught, short and direct, not a show. She brushed me head to toe with the smoke and made me spit into the bowl, and then took it to the east side of the yard and dumped it with her right hand and didn't look back walking in. She told my aunt the night air gave her a chill, so we were going to keep the windows shut a while, and my aunt agreed, because there's no argument against an old woman's joints. I shoved the couches away from the glass and moved the mattress upstairs without making it a big thing. My brother joked about me being dramatic, and I let him because explaining the knee would just make him laugh until it didn't. I never slept in that house again. I told them I got better rest at my mom's place, and that was close enough to the truth for everybody. When the family went back the next summer, I found a reason to stay with a friend. I still lock windows I don't even use. I still wake up sometimes with my left side cold and my right ear picking up somebody's breath that isn't anybody's breath. And I lie very still and think, check the knee, check the bend, check the part they can't fake. People argue online about names for these things and whether Wendigo is even right outside certain stories, and I don't care about names. I care about how quiet it got when it looked back at us. If you leave a mouth open long enough, something will learn your taste. And they don't rush. They never rush. They'll study you for months before you notice they're already lying down beside you.